just make a couple quick surveys in the room. I always say it's against my religion to not start on time. I don't like to punish those who are here on time. I know that some have already gone to try and get a couple of people from the parking lot to come on in, but just while we're getting started in a second, let me get a little bit of feel for who's in the room in terms of denomination, role, meaning lay leader, clergy, and whether or not there's something specific in terms of your particular organization that you want to get from this morning. Ladies first.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Barbara Bronsford with Mountain View Baptist Church. I am a trustee of the church as well as the finance secretary.
Thank you.
My name is Pastor Tracy Bill. I'm with New Jerusalem. I'm the chairman of our housing committee.
My name is Perry Dennis. I'm with New Jerusalem Refuge Outreach. And we're here to just get stronger and stronger and help to develop plans to continue the problem that we got started and make it more viable for the community and for us to have instruments and knowledge to get those goals out.
Okay.
I'm Pastor John Cannon. I'm with New Jerusalem as well. Just here to learn.
Thank you.
My name is A.D. Caesar. I'm the executive director of the Good Shepherd's House, and we're a social enterprise that provides shared housing for folks transitioning out of homelessness.
Thank you.
I'm Julie Mullen. I'm with St. Anthony's at Padua Catholic Church. I'm a social worker there. I work with a lot of people. They're helping them find affordable housing in our community.
Thank you.
I'm Angela Sherman, Tabernacle Baptist Church, Hudson Street. I'm the treasurer of the church.
Okay. So good mixture. We have some more folks coming in. A good mixture of officers as well as clergy and a little variety. Katie, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say welcome and thank you all for coming. I'm Katie Davenport and I'm with Community Works, one of the co-sponsors of today's event. It's lovely to see you all here on a Saturday morning and excited about housing and especially affordable housing. Community Works offers these types of trainings really to help bring more knowledge to the community and especially the faith community as they think about what they can do and what's in the realm of possibility with both their property as well as what they could acquire and do for their church and their community. So we're happy to provide this education and we're hoping to meet all of you and forge more deep relationships as you all go on these journeys to build and create housing for your communities. A few housekeeping items. The bathrooms, I'm sure you probably are trying to find them sometimes. Out those double doors where you came and to the right. You're welcome to get up and use them at any time. We're live streaming this event as well to our friends in Beaufort, Orangeburg, and Columbia today. So we've got a text message option up there if they want to text, and they can also drop that into the YouTube chat. So we might be getting questions from our fellow colleagues throughout the state. But just great to see you all and welcome.
Thank you, Katie. And good morning, everyone, again. My name is F.A. Johnson with Pastors, Inc. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to partner with Community Works for what is our second annual faith-based development intensive. The goal, as Katie outlined, is to provide a general overview of the affordable housing component in the industry, community development, economic development, and quite frankly, how to look at leveraging the church's assets to both execute mission, but also to provide other revenue streams. Those who have heard me speak before know that I say that before I learned Jesus wept, my father taught me a feast is made for laughter and wine maketh merry, but money answereth all things. Book of Ecclesiastes, there's not too many that I can quote chapter and verse, but that one was pounded into my head from an early stage, is that we have to think more business-like as we move forward into operations. So as I see we still have a few people coming in, but as those folks come in, I do want to go ahead and again, we appreciate Community Works working with Pastors, Inc. We've got Reverend Carter in Orangeburg with St. Stephen's United Methodist Church. Specifically, I don't, It's separate from the church campus. They have some 50 acres that they're looking at trying to figure out exactly what and how they want to develop those properties. In Columbia, we have Bishop Redford with Ecumenical Ministries as well represented, and the Love House in Beaufort. So for those who are watching by live stream, we welcome you and appreciate your participation. I think in terms of format and approach, my thought is a little bit like a sermonic structure. A little bit of education, a little bit of inspiration, but when we leave, we hope to be transformed and adjust how we're living and how we're acting and how we're responding. So with that, from an educational standpoint, we will want to focus on this by doing it, talking about some of the technical aspects of how do we carry out development. From an inspirational standpoint, we want to walk through several examples to show that it is done, it can be done, how some other congregations are carrying out development, and provide some nuggets of how we might be able to apply it in our own local segment. Particularly for those of you who are in Greenville, it certainly would be helpful that as thoughts, questions, or issues cross your mind, it likely crosses someone else's mind. So let's make this conversational and participatory. This is not me sitting here giving a speech. This is an education and exchange as a part of how we move forward. Again, we spoke about revenue generation. I'm talking also a little bit about debt structuring. All of those things of how we can approach and look at things in a more business-like perspective. We'll also talk a little bit about the process about Pastors Inc. as a development entity, as a partner, both with our faith-based institutions, but also with our governmental entities, our state, local, federal, and our community development financial institution partners like Community Works, and how all those factors can play together. So whether that's serving as a project manager, carrying out a project, a co-developer, a fee developer, establishing public-private partnerships, all of those different aspects of how pastors tries to help organizations and faith-based groups to actually move forward into implementation. As for me, from a technical, morning, Ms. Melanie, from a technical standpoint, my background is in finance. I was a finance major at Morehouse and got my start doing commercial lending. So that certainly impacts my view of the world. I've also spent time in the public sector as the development director for the city of Roanoke Redevelopment Housing Authority. So I also get the financing stage. For the last 10 years or so, I've been working a lot with the faith-based community as well, trying to look and engage into more commercial development, things that are providing other revenue streams and moving forward. But we can't do this alone. It does take partnership. And so you look at some of the partners and organizations that pastors has worked with over the years, from local units of government like the City of Charleston, City of North Charleston, Town of Hollywood, to some of the hospitals, the VA, Roper St. Francis. Anyway, why are those relationships important? How could the hospitals be a factor in what we're trying to do? This is a participatory conversation.
Making sure that you notify the individuals of the different benefits or health crises, wellness overall.
Okay, and so part of wellness is housing stability. And so that provides another basis of referrals as it relates to potential occupants, renters, those types of situations. So, so partnership as a key piece of that. In terms of the organization overall, we've had representation from across denominations: United Methodist, African Methodist Episcopal, Presbyterian, Reformed Episcopal, Baptist, just a wide variety in terms of representation and membership. I will just defer to our Vice Chair, Reverend Anna Miller, in Orangeburg, and I took the liberty. We had a conversation 2 Saturdays ago with some churches, and so she pointed out some thoughts and perspectives from her standpoint of just real plain talk from the pulpit perspective. So I just want to share that real briefly with you.
What you are doing in your respective places. But I want to not only share the fact that we're
in the back of the room. Paul, can you?
Do some things together. I want to speak to you out of experience. 23 years pastors have been around, helping in the community, but I have to say to some people it's the best kept secret in the world. We're here to help each other get a part of what we call the big picture. monies that we sometimes don't hear about. And I have to say this from experience, sometimes money that we don't trust each other with. Only because we can't get it over to our constituents. We have persons among our congregation that don't trust us. And half the time we don't trust each other. But there is another way. There are funds out here that can help each church. Funds out here that can help a family have a home.
Now, sometimes the truth can be an uncomfortable truth, but I can tell you as the person who oftentimes is trying to be the project proponent to move forward to help the core leadership expand and explain that vision to the rest of the congregation, that can be a sensitive topic. Nobody here understands that? Nobody relates to that? Thank you. Selling the vision, which is why these conversations, we can't just have the pastors present. We have to have whatever the appropriate title may be, the stewards, the trustees, the vestry, those other leaders present as a part of this conversation, because otherwise then folks kind of look at you a little bit strange, and that trust factor becomes a key item there.
In a community of color, those who have come here from other countries, other places, it's time for us to invest. Trust us. And we will help you. So I say to you, look at the work we've done. Many churches. We have ribbon cuttings in Hollywood. We're expanding our base. And we want to help your church. Or we want to help a young person or anyone who needs housing. And so I say, if you come with us, many of the banks that we're working with have given us the opportunity to invest in you. So I ask you to invest in you and stop relying on chicken sales, chicken dinners, fish fry. Our churches, it's time to stop relying on the offering plate. Let us get some investments so that we can bring revenue into our church. But you know you got to go home and convince that person in the pew next to you that we.
All right. So it makes business sense of expanding and adjusting our vision and our thought process. So when I made the reference to transforming the way that we think, the way that we engage, how do we go beyond the pulpit to engage? And there are different aspects of it. She talked about helping families. The affordable housing piece of it is a key piece of service to the community, but there's also the business aspect of how that impacts the church and how the church benefits as well. So that is part of that thought process of how do we do that? Whether it's land that we as the church own ourselves, whether it's reaching out to our local units of government to see if there are properties that we can acquire. All of those different pieces that all factor into it. This is a concept of a project one of the cities, the city of Charleston would put out a request for proposals, and pastors put together a concept to respond to do some commercial service space downstairs and housing up above. Now, we did not secure that bid, but it's about thinking differently and going and engaging with our municipalities differently. And you all have a resource. You have at least 6 or 8 representatives of Community Works here. And as Reverend Miller articulated, you have your financial partners that are willing to come to the table, but we have to give them something to work with. Now, you know, we can talk about the Lord, but we got to also talk about the money. How this is going to get repaid, how it's going to work. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wanting to know, is this specifically though for the funds that you're discussing, is it specifically for 501c3 organizations? Because not everybody runs their church as a nonprofit.
That is a perfect question and frames the why Pastors Inc. exists. So Pastors Inc. was formed as a single 501c3 so that every single church doesn't have to have a separate nonprofit, because the church itself cannot apply for federal funds, municipal funds, to carry out the programmatic activity. Now, people say, but the church is a nonprofit. The church is a nonprofit. But the church itself as a body cannot apply as an eligible entity to receive those funds. And so pastor serves as a financial intermediary to then go and make application on behalf of a church, a project, or what have you along the way. Now, there are churches that have their own 501c3 or that are forming their own 501c3, and that is fine. But if it is a one-off activity, does it make sense to do that? And so for some smaller churches, it may not make sense to have the expense and the programmatic overhead of applying and carrying through that process as a part of that. But then some who have larger developments, doing more things on a more frequent basis, it may make sense. But yes, that is exactly correct. But one of the things that we will touch on, and I'm just going to go ahead and mention it because we're here right now, is we still have to have our financial house in order. Okay, we have to have our financials. We can have the vision, but if we can't produce 3 years of profit and loss statements, we're not going to be able to walk into Community Works or any other financial institution and borrow the capital we need to carry out the projects. And that sounds basic, but this is one of the few aspects where our ability, and I'm talking about from the faith-based standpoint, to not have to file a tax return actually hurts us because our financials may not necessarily always be where we need them to be. And so I just want to go ahead. That's one of my little sermonette pieces that I'm always harping on, that we have to focus from that standpoint. But again, just to be clear, a 501c3 may be nice and it may be helpful to apply for certain funds, but there are other financial partners that we already heard. There's another one that's here that is at the table that can also help provide access and resource for those funds. Yes, ma'am.
Got a question. Does grants apply to 501c? Do they have the same, is it the same
Okay.
for grants as it is for federal funds?
Okay, so the granting source, so let me make one difference because I want to make sure I'm clear on one aspect. The church can apply for a loan, but I meant in terms of applying for grants, and particularly I was using it. But for those who want that 501c3 so they can take their write-off as a part of that contribution and that deduction, that's why the need for that 501c3. But there may be other resources that the church as a body could apply for. But typically, if the granting source is looking for a 501c3, at least on the government side, you want that separation between the church and the nonprofit. Okay. So that's really part of our focus and please, any other questions as we go along? I appreciate that. Yes, ma'am. No.
For those faith organizations just getting started, don't have the profit loss statements just yet, is there help for them through this program?
So that is where it may be that Pastors Inc. may be the applicant because they're looking at the balance sheet. And quite honestly, this gets really deep in the water, but part of the reason that our financials, when I say our pastors' financials, require a lot of study is because we carry a lot of deferred forgivable debt for other entities because it's booked on our books. So we may not have the assets, but if we apply to the city of Greenville and they attach a 10-year deferred forgivable mortgage to your property, somebody has to carry that on their books, which is why we also want to make sure that there's professional management of the project to get it done, but also long-term to make sure that it's in compliance. Because if we fall out of compliance, then we might have to do what? Repay the money, and we don't want to do that. Okay? All right. Other questions on that subject? Okay, but as things come up, please, let's continue that dialogue. So again, how do we partner? And that's the other thing, and partnering is not a bad word, okay? And I will say this, and since I'm going to follow Reverend Meadows' lead in terms of just being a little bit brutal and honest, we, when it comes to the church, don't like anybody else in our business. And sometimes it might be another church that may have something that complements. Maybe one church has the food bank and the other's providing the housing. But together you can apply for certain resources. So we have to think outside of our silos and how we can collaborate and work differently. It is a different way of thinking and a different process and mindset. Let me hit the mute button. So when it comes to development, one of the things that I think of personally, as well as for those who represent, how do we reduce our costs? So this is pastor's office building with 2 apartments upstairs and 2 commercial spaces downstairs. So we start thinking about how is it that we can use our assets so that we can operate more efficiently. So for us, that means not having overhead, because you have 2 apartments as well as commercial space to carry the bulk of the expense and the debt associated with redeveloping the property. Why does that matter to us? I'm sorry? Saving money. And so what do we have as a church entity? We have buildings, we have the church, supplemental space, we have Sunday school rooms. One of the agencies that does a lot of veterans housing approached us on behalf of one of the churches represented about renting from one of the Presbyterian churches the classroom space Monday through Friday to do counseling for veterans. Classrooms aren't being used Monday through Friday in most cases. It's secure. They can have counselors come in and meet. But for the church, it becomes a revenue stream, but it also is another way of touching individuals that may not necessarily otherwise be familiar with the organization. So again, we're talking about being creative in other ways of how we can use what we have existing. So separate from that, when we start talking about housing and affordable housing, and a little bit further on, I'm going to talk through definitions of affordable housing and what that means, what those opportunities are. But there are ways of how we can be efficient in terms of how we do this. We initially built this 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in West Ashley in the Charleston area. That product for the Charleston market is it hits a sweet spot that is easy to sell and easy to accommodate. So we've then taken and replicated and built virtually the same house, some with a garage, some without, in North Charleston, bless you, Charleston County, Hollywood. Basically just once you know and understand what your costs are and the ability to move and do things. So part of that learning curve is the first time out of the chute, getting comfortable with what that development process looks like. But once you have that down, then it makes it easier to replicate as you are moving forward. But from a proponent standpoint, from the church's standpoint, understanding the market is critical. And having someone that can help us guide and understand what is our target market. And so, Ms. Franklin, I second to think about this answer, but in Greenville, can you give me some guidance? So if you just close your eyes and you say you put on the ground square footage and amenities, meaning size, bedroom mix, that you know is going to move locally.
Square footage, 1,800 to 2,000 square feet. 1,800 to 2,000 square feet. Okay, so that within that bandwidth is a saying. So obviously, what does that mean? Putting 1,200 square feet on the ground, we're going to have a larger time leasing it up or selling it. Too large, are people going to be able to afford it? So those are the terms of the ways of how we think into what is it that we're going to do, because it's great to say this is what we want to do, but if it's not based in what's marketable, then we're creating a different problem for ourselves. And we're trying to create solutions both for the community but also for our own economics. Does that make sense? So when I say market-driven, that's what I'm referring to as a part of making those decisions.
Pastors, to celebrate this time together, to celebrate this home, and we ask that this home
Palmetto Community Action Agency.
In the name of this community, Hollywood.
Palmetto Community Action Agency actually took a non-traditional role with this particular house and one other to serve as lender, to participate.
because they serve a similar demographic and wanted to get their housing unit up. So there are partners who can come to the table that you might not otherwise ordinarily think of in terms of how is it that we're going to put these units on the ground. Why do I say that? Why is that important? Because when we think of the word capital, what is the first thing that comes to our minds? Money. And money is a key piece of capital. But what are other sources and aspects of capital that are required? I'm sorry? Assets? Land. Okay. I'm sorry?
All that sums up as assets, right?
All that sums up as assets, different forms, whether it's liquid or not liquid. Okay. What else? Services, okay. You have, who is our co-sponsor here? We have Community Works here, okay. That is a part of social capital. You have the relationships to get that done. The political capital, you have the ability to reach. And then your members within the congregation and their different areas of expertise and knowledge base. So when we say we don't have the capital, we're thinking only in one aspect. But if somebody can get you an appointment in the mayor's office, that's social capital. If someone can walk in and have their loan officer sit with you in the morning session, that's capital. To be able to ask the guy who's going to look at what we're presenting a question directly and say, how do I structure this? How do I bring this forward? All of those key pieces are part of putting those together. Just in terms of pastors, not just about physical development, 2 weekends ago we did home buyer education workshops. We've done senior education pieces, one called, should mama sell her house? Talking about estate planning, those types of things. Things that also can relate directly to the membership and the congregants in terms of how to improve their economics, whether it's fair housing workshops, all of those type of elements and things are other ways of how we can engage with our surrounding partners, because it's easy enough to show up when it's time to write a check or ask for a check, but are there other things? You all represent, if you took the membership among your various congregations and you quantify that and say, among the 50 people in this room, we represent another 500 people, that will get the attention of those who, whether it's loan officers who are trying to get mortgage loans out or do other type of education or other type of activities, that you can touch bodies that they can't touch. That is another aspect of social capital and how they may get an interest in coming to the table to work with you. But going back to the money, it does take dollars and leveraging, because real estate is not an inexpensive sport. It eats, sleeps, and drinks money 3 times a day. Okay, and so we have to be intentional about what we're doing, but we also have to make sure we understand. In this particular case, working with the town of Hollywood and Charleston County, certainly the town of Hollywood putting in land, contributing land. State Housing had put in dollars. Applying through for home funds is a specific type of federal funds, home and CDBG, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But those opportunities, to provide non-traditional sources that we can apply to other than just the church writing the check. So different ways of how we're going to look at that so that we can reduce the cost down to make it to where the rents actually make sense and are profitable. Questions, thoughts, or issues? From a
Thinking, from reading and processing. If you have the land, and you tore down the houses that were on the land, but thinking of rebuilding, I saw on there eligible for USDA and rental assistance, I think it was. So that means that you could qualify to get somebody else, basically to be the property manager, or I'm looking at the rental assistance, but I'm just trying to understand.
So, all right. So there are. Let's pause here and dig a little bit deeper. There are 2 ways. But there are more than 2. There are 2
broad buckets of how we might approach a project. We can subsidize the individual, or we can subsidize the project. Subsidize the individual meaning whether or not they're receiving Section 8, Rural Development Rental Assistance, HUD, VASH, some other type of assistance to the end renter, or down payment assistance if we're selling homes, if there's assistance to the individual that would occupy what we're doing. And then there are subsidies and things that we may apply for as it relates to the project. So depending on the location, it is surprising sometimes when you get outside of the municipal boundaries how close USDA may be able to assist. And here's the piece. Now, U.S. Department of Agriculture, what in the world? They loan money? Yes. They grant money? Yes. Housing? Yes. Multifamily? Yes. Commercial? Yes. Daycare facility, assisted living, the full, that people don't necessarily realize that those are projects with which they fund. There are other resources as well based on geography. There are, once you put in different resources, you can put in the street address or the census tract of where the property is located, and that might avail you to other resources. We call them qualified census tracts, whether that means that you could apply for opportunity zone money, or whether it's, my mind just went blank. But other resources of what you can apply for. So knowing where it is and what's available. New Markets Tax Credit, that just completely left now. But, and then some of it, quite honestly, the census tracts may make it more attractive for certain lenders who need to make certain loans in certain communities. And so just by the virtue of the geography might make your loan a little bit more attractive because they need to place some loans in those communities. Just right now, there's an RFP that I have some folks responding for that is geographically based. They need projects, in this case it's Charleston, and they've got other communities throughout the country that they're specifically. So, if you're in Greenville, you can't apply for that specific pot of money because they're targeting these 15 communities. And so sometimes that's the way. So that's where, what is it that's eligible? Now, I will say this, I am not a proponent of doing something simply because we're chasing the money. I heard there's a grant for this. If that's not part of your mission, it's not part of your mission. If you say we're not trying to do affordable housing, or we're not trying to do some commercial development, then there's no need of applying and going after those resources if that's not something that's a part of your mission. In this particular case, New Israel Reformed Episcopal made a decision over a decade ago that for every property that came available within the community, they were going to buy it. And so they just went one by one and assembled those properties. Now, some of them, like the one on the top, sat vacant, paying insurance, cutting the grass, boarding it up. Money is going which way? Out the door. So we work with them as, again, now, Reverend Miller started off the conversation with the fact of convincing our congregations to move and take certain action, and fear and trust and those type of pieces. So despite having the vision to buy all of this property, there was still reluctance in terms of actually moving into development. So we have to start small and start easy. So we start off with just one rehab. Working with the VA to put a veteran in there who ended up staying there almost over 5 years, but to do that as a rehab, and working with the city to provide the financing, really almost 100% financing. Now that is very hard transaction to structure today, but it inures confidence as the church sees, hey, this can work, which is really part of the conversation we're trying to say here. And so then we move on to do something market rate, and I'm going to talk a little bit more, but when that previous slide said it was limited at 65% of the area median income, because that's what the money required. In order to get that money, these are the population bases that we have to serve. But as a market rate transaction, we can rent to whoever can afford to pay the rent. So that emboldened a little bit more confidence. Now, what I'm most proud of for them, which they were able to structure, is to taking that school building, and instead of, well, they still run the school for the little kids, but to turn around and lease that to a Montessori school on a turnkey basis.
Why is that significant? What's the significance of that? Bringing in income. I mean, extra $8,000 a month is nice, isn't it? Without having to worry about the plate. Okay, so it provides a nice revenue stream. But the other piece of it is, how many of us, any of us operating any church-provided schools or daycares right now? Anyone in the room? One? St. Anthony's? Okay. Those are employees of the church that are running or volunteers? Hmm? They're employees. Okay. So, employees of the church, and I've seen that scenario play out quite frequently, and there's nothing wrong. We are providing the jobs, but that also means we're having the reporting, liability, etc. In this particular case, the church is collecting a lease payment. And it's a different position. Someone else is actually operating the facility, but the thing that I always like to point out as a reminder, though, is when we're talking about borrowing money to, if we needed to acquire that, Mr. Paul, which scenario, just without any other facts, the church is going to renovate this building and operate a daycare, or they have Sundrops with a 10-year lease that's going to come in and operate it? Which one is going to get your attention a little bit quicker? 10-year lease. Okay. So it makes it turns it into an asset because that lease is something you can borrow against. You can take that lease and literally go to the bank and borrow against that. It's a little bit different thought process. Questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
Would you recommend, because this example, you kind of went piece by piece, would you recommend to take this approach or look at it from a visionary standpoint and start with master planning for the broader area?
Awesome question. For those who may not have heard, the question was doing this incrementally versus master planning and rolling out a larger project. For the project manager, I would much rather at one time. The problem and the challenge, though, is, and again, can we just be frank here? We got to talk honestly here in family to talk about things, is it is difficult to walk into a church meeting and say, we put this master plan together, we're going to go out and borrow $5 million, we're going to do this all in one fell swoop. Unless you have walked the walk already and gone somewhere with it before, it is a very difficult conversation. And so it is technically what Ms. Melanie is talking about is the preferred route and what makes the most economic sense. And quite honestly, is what is going to get the attention of our lenders, our financial partners, our city folks. I say this quite frequently, and it really gets to this point. Sometimes our vision is too low. Our vision needs to be higher to get the attention for those who want to write the checks. There are people who want to support these initiatives, but it does require size and scale. But I shouldn't say unfortunate, but it is the reality that unless there is strong leadership, that the churches tend to look at things incrementally. One of our locations that is watching took the vision and purchased large acreage. Now they have it. Now how do we implement and move forward with it incrementally? And I think you have to look at least a catalyst project that has a ripple effect. Think about it, you're sitting by the water and you throw a rock into it, and that ripple that expands out. What are those projects that have that ripple effect? We have to look at it from that standpoint. And looking at that in one whole fell swoop, now, and actually you kind of segue into, that's the market rate project that was done. But that's where then we segment into, I think, a current piece I'll touch on right quick. What's the question?
From the live stream locations. Is there a cap on the number of affordable housing projects in one county or region?
My knee-jerk reaction is I'm going to say no. Now, subject to obviously every jurisdiction, whether it's, HUD provides each jurisdiction with a certain amount of money that those cities then turn around and redistribute to what they call subrecipients, us, the applicants that come in. And so I guess that does, to the extent that you're trying to fund it that way, that does create certain caps. The other thing I will say, there are specific programs like a USDA that, if they're putting 10 million on the street, that's going to create certain caps there.
But I mean, I think it's really going to be a function of what they can afford to finance and what they can support. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Elisha. And please keep those questions coming. This is very much a participatory process. This is one of those projects that's in the site plan that you see here. Now, this was taken before we demolished what was the school building there on the site, and you can see the church. And so this quadruplex, we've demolished this, and that's the location there. The challenge here that very real in this case struggling with is interest rates have moved a little bit in the last few months. So the gap on this project, this is a $900,000 just pure construction, never mind the soft costs of architect engineers, but $900,000 for that quadruplex. The gap is going the wrong direction because sometimes we sit and wait and we go to committee and somebody doesn't show up for committee, so Sister Doris doesn't show up, so we're going to wait till next month and talk about it. And the next thing is 6 months, and we've been talking about something for a year and we haven't moved on it. But the markets continue to move. And funding sources, while actionable, are perishable. So money that is available today may not necessarily be available tomorrow. This is another just infill project of veterans housing, 4 units. And I just give the perspective so you can really see, when I talk about vacant land, this is nestled in the middle of the block behind the church and one of the existing assets that we dropped 4 units of veterans housing. I give a little bit of an idea of what the capital stack starts to look like in terms of what it took to put that together. Again, a smaller project as a starter project, but this is something of the size and scale that was easier for the church to buy in. But I will tell you this, because it cash flows, they understand and they get future development. But it does take patience throughout the process to pull those different pieces together. When I talk about thinking differently, yes, sir.
So back to a couple of slides back, I guess, when you spoke of leasing the school, Montessori school,
Mm-hmm.
and now the church is able to take this lease and take it before a financial institute and they consider the lease. How much of it do they consider?
How much of the project will they consider?
How much of the lease payment will they consider towards financing the new project?
All right, Ms. Virginia, can you get our loan officer back there up here for me, please? So we have different underwriting criteria of how the lenders will tack into projects. And so typically looking at whether or not we can have 80% loan based on the value of the project or the cost of the project. So I think my answer would be that the maximum, based on the example I gave of the Montessori school lease, how much would they be able to borrow in relation to that lease? And my response is it's a function of what the costs are to renovate and what the valuation is. And then the other parameter is how does that relate to the debt service? Because they're going to want a certain amount of cushion. And that cushion, I use the term debt coverage ratio. What's the relationship between our mortgage and how much rent's coming in? So they at a minimum, okay, 1-to-1, we need enough revenue to pay the mortgage, but the bank is obviously may want a 20% cushion in case of a dip. And so it's not so much a function of how much of the lease payment is that you're receiving, but how does that then respond to your mortgage payment and the valuation? Is there anything you would add to that?
No, I mean, you're exactly right. And we can go up to 90% on our projects. Banks traditionally are 80%, but we can go up to 90%. And the debt coverage that we look at is a minimum of 1.15 times. But that's taking into account your mortgage payment, your taxes, your insurance, and everything. We want to make sure that you can cover everything with that.
But we're a church. We're not tax exempt.
Okay, property. Oh, that's right. You're on that property taxes. There's insurance.
There's insurance, yeah. Okay. All right. So does everybody understand it? Yes, ma'am.
Can you repeat some of what you said on the mic so that people
So yes, for those of you in Beaufort, Orangeburg, Columbia, Community Works actually has a little bit higher bandwidth in terms of how they look at projects.
whether instead of 80%, 90% of the appraised value or the loan to cost, that they'll go up to 90%. And then I talked about the 20% cushion that they will underwrite down to a 15% cushion, which gives a little bit more borrowing ability when it comes to the project. So, you know, what is the lenders would say a 1.15 debt coverage, which means we need to have a 15% day oops money. Somebody's got bad credit. Somebody's not paying us money. Okay? Fair enough. Thank you, Ms. Virginia. I appreciate that. All right. So one of the other things from an education standpoint, I just want to talk about when I say changing the way we look at things. Plymouth Church came wanting to, the church was changing. And so they wanted to go build elsewhere. Now, being downtown Charleston, it was a highly sought after piece of property. My question I presented them was the Grace Chapel Church, which at that particular time we just finished construction on in Beaufort, building for them. And I said, here's the size church we just built for them, and here's what it's cost. Is that really what we want to do? And of course, the church leadership, yes, we want a new church. But we were able to identify an existing church that had previously been foreclosed on in West Ashley and go in. I did the math on put a new roof, put in a new heating and air system, put in new carpeting, new flooring, painting, completely new building. But instead of building it, renovating it. They walked away, I think we spent somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000 renovating that church. And they sold the sanctuary for $1.7 million, which effectively meant that they were able to put $1 million in the bank instead of spending $2 million to build a new church. It is a different conversation. And I will say this, and I'm going to use a very real example. I try not to call their name, although it's pretty easy because most folks know where I go to church. But we had, I guess it's been over a decade ago, a group out of Ohio that was willing to provide $3 million in new market tax credits funds, meaning no mortgage payment. USDA was willing to lend $5 million to build an assisted living facility. After debt service, after hiring 20-some people, it was going to throw off $100,000 a year to the church. But the church was going to have to borrow $5 million to do it. And we had like Community Works, we had a lender at the table that was willing to do it. The decision, once it got through committee, was to go build another church. That is the thought process that is not uncommon. And in all views, that they still view that as a success today because they have a satellite location that is doing well and growing membership. And I understand that. But I also struggle still with the idea of not having to be able to hire 20-some people and have net income of $100,000 a year. Because in my mind, I look at it, that's going to pay some custodial salaries, church secretary salaries, pastoral salaries, contribute toward sanctuary renovations, those types of things. And here's the thing. You could sit here and say, FA got this idea, he wants us to do this, or he's suggesting we do this. It's one thing if I say it, but if a loan officer is willing to write the check and make the loan, somebody else has looked at it and thought about it and considered it and evaluated it. And that's part of the thing is to say, to walk in, it's like, even if we are 30% off base, does that mean I can convince Community Works it's a good idea, some other bank that's an idea along the way? And so that's part of the conversation where you have to, in those internal conversations, push back and have that dynamic. Questions, thoughts, or issues? Y'all disagreeing with me? No? Okay. All right. So I want to use this one more example, just talk through just some terminology. And as I say, from an education standpoint, when we start thinking about things. Greater Middleton Chapel AME was a combination of 3 smaller churches that consolidated into one. I believe they sold one of the sanctuaries, but we're struggling with what to do with the second of those. We were able to start looking at who are partners. Again, when I talk about partnership and who are other people that can help us in our vision. At that time, Alcoholics Anonymous was looking for something that made economic sense of what they could afford to pay for rent in a highly inflated market of commercial space. But again, sanctuary space is gathering space. So we were able to work out a long-term lease with Alcoholics Anonymous to come in and lease that space, but then also use that lease to then go get the money to do the renovations as a part of that. So the church wasn't writing the check. The church had the building as the asset that we then could then take that lease to go get those dollars for that renovation as a part of that. But from a business standpoint, here's where we start using different terminology. If I'm renting my house out, I'm sorry for those of y'all, if I'm renting my house out for $1,000 a month, I'm paying my property, I'm paying those bills. On the commercial side of things, we talk about net leases, single net leases, double net, triple net, which is just a fancy way of saying how much are we passing on to the tenants? Are we passing on our maintenance expense, our property taxes, our insurance as a part of that, so that that rental rate truly is what is going to hit the bottom line? And it is a different thought process, it's a different mindset, because most of us haven't been exposed to that segment of it, so we don't think of it that way, okay? And so we have to, this is where I come back that you have expertise in the room. You have someone like me, someone like Melanie, someone like Paul, we've got Community Works in the room, Ms. Denise Franklin back there in the back. You have resources here who understand this segment as a part of that. Before I move on from it, that conversation about triple net lease or at least net leasing, do I need to expound on that a little bit more, or are we okay there? Talk to me. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, the point I'm making is typically in a commercial lease, we're not only looking at what the rental rate is for that space, but we're going to take our overall operating costs, expenses, and pass those on to the tenant. So for example, going back, I started off showing the pastor's office building. My leasing agent asked up front, what is our insurance expense? What is our property tax expense? All of those expenses, and then we divide it by the square footage of the building, and each tenant is paying a pro rata portion of those expenses. Again, that makes it more efficient for us as operators because that is being built into the tenant's expense, not as an owner's expense. The other thing, if you have a true commercial lease, who is responsible for ongoing maintenance in that building? And you want to answer? Give me an answer. It's up there? Tenant is responsible for the maintenance. You are responsible for the roof, the outside. But when they say the toilet is clogged, thank you for letting me know. Make sure you get a good plumber. I'm being light about it, but why does this matter? Because typically what is going to happen when, okay, we have our space. We have someone who expressed an interest in it. We're going to self-manage this. We don't need to hire Ms. Franklin. We don't need to hire Ms. Melanie. We don't need to hire FA. We're going to do this ourselves. But we don't know, and I'm speaking globally, you all are, we different because we're here and we're having this conversation. We ask different questions about how those expenses are going to be maintained. We're going to ask these questions. We're going to make sure that someone, because what I don't want you all to do, and again, I'm not even going to say the municipality where this church is located, but they had the foresight, and they bought a piece of property with the view really of because of the land that came behind it. The commercial space in the front was just there. They really wanted the land behind it to build the church on. And one of the first tenants that approached them because of the amount of space until they were ready to build was a nursery. And I do not mean a child nursery. What's another name for it? What other type of business as a nursery that needs commercial space? Plants.
Legal or illegal?
No, these were legal. Well, okay, that is in today's market, that is a very good question. The question was legal or illegal. So this particular church had a nursery approach them to take the corner space, and it's out of the way, it's on the side, and it made good economic sense. But instead of hiring a real estate professional to help them negotiate the lease, They wanted to handle it themselves. To which then they called me after the fact. They needed some assistance because they did not include the water bill in the tenant expenses. Yeah. Yes, your face says that. Yes, Katie. Yes. Oh, yes. Do I need to repeat that again? Yes, thank you. See? Okay. That's all right. That is a fundamental problem because they were looking at the front end of, we're going to get $2,500 a month in rent. And we're happy about that, or whatever that number was. But the main expense for a nursery is water, and you did not have a professional on board to negotiate. I can't make this stuff up, y'all. I'm being serious. I mean, and I'm not picking fun at them either. I mean, I'm trying, but I use it as an example because these type of things matter when we're starting getting into it, because there are things that we may not necessarily have been trained to think and ask, and we need to position ourselves. And I'm gonna give one more example in a minute, but yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to how some tenants, commercial tenants, may need customized outfitting
Yes.
within the building?
All right. So if you saw the space, Miss Nelly was asking, for those of you on live stream, about how some tenants may need customized upfitting of their space. And for those of you who are here and you look right across the hall, you see what I call a vanilla box. You've got carpet and you've got white sheetrock. That's all we're doing. The rest of it is called tenant upfit. Now, we might provide what commercial folks call a tenant upfit allowance. We will give you $3 a foot that you can use to build your space out. But we as a church are not going to go and customize this space for you. We're not doing it. Don't care how good this money sounds over here, because guess what? Tenant goes out of business in 6 months. You've spent all this money on the front end. No, you, the tenant, are going to incur those expenses. Thank you, ma'am. And that is a very key fundamental piece of that. Now, the good thing about tenant improvements is, and I don't want to get too far down the road on this, but if it truly becomes a fixture, who does it belong to? Say that louder. The owner. Okay, us. So I like the us answer, but yes, to the owner. Okay, so that is a good piece of it. If they go ahead and run the water lines, I mean, I had a potential occupant for that office space that wanted to have, that's going to be the plumber come out and look at it. They walked away because it's slab and existing construction. So I knew from the beginning that was going to be an expensive venture. But those are very good questions. Now, and I harp on this about the professional piece, and actually, I'm going to actually give two very specific examples that are relevant here. A church on the coast had the vision and bought a motel, existing motel. After a few years of operations, it looks fairly straightforward, and some of the trustees figured, why are we paying this management expense and we can self-manage it? By the time I came on board, or well, I said on board, I became aware of the situation, they had run it in the ground. Because we believe that we're going to save money and do it ourselves. And that is part of the conversation that we have to change that narrative from a community. Well, sister so-and-so, she been teaching for 30 years. She know how to run a daycare. But that's not her business, okay? Since so-and-so may have worked in management at a hotel, but has he owned and worked as an owner's rep? Again, these are real conversations and very real examples, okay? One project that I have, and that you have seen, that I had a photo of, in very real terms. Client was very happy. They're still happy. It cash flows. My fee in that particular project was $60,000 to get it from concept all the way through operations. To the trustees, the next meeting for phase 2, we can save that money we paid Johnson, and we're going to do it ourselves the next phase. That's 9 years ago, and I can show you the site. It still looks the same. So they have a functioning asset that is cash flowing for the church. But it looks easy. So we're going to do the phase 2 ourselves. I can drive you right now. Phase 2 looks the same today as it did 9 years ago. So that's not me as a commercial saying I won't hire me. What I'm saying is hire someone. You have two other very talented professionals in the room that can carry the ball and get there. And we're not saving money by doing that. That's really what I'm trying. Because it's the same thing when it comes to construction. Perfect segue. One thing thou shalt not do. Thou shalt not start a construction project until you have every dime in place. Okay? If at some point, we own the land, we might as well go ahead and get started. We're going to do this as we go. That is where you draw the line in the meeting and say, no, it is not going to end well. We have to know where every dollar is coming from and have some rainy day money, contingency money, in terms of how we're going to get through this project, okay? This is one of those instances where the church started construction midstream, contractor billed, invoiced, they paid far beyond where he was and the project, and then ran into trouble, and the project stalled for years. Now, why is that relevant for you? Because, and we touched on this, there are different underwriting criteria that our loan officers are going to use in evaluating how much the church can borrow, particularly when we start talking about church development. Giving units, membership. By the way, is there a difference between membership and giving units? What's the difference? Let's park right there for us. Well, okay, amen. Ooh, now wait. Now that's a real answer. All right, but no. So, and I'm getting this because when we start talking about so our main focus today is not on development of the sanctuary itself, but other assets, other opportunities. But it still becomes part of the underwriting conversation. Membership represents names on the roll, and as you say, whether they're given or not. So that might curtail that. But then also, how do those members represent and relate back to family units? That if we are a single household, that is one giving unit. 2 members, 1 unit. So a family of 5, mom, dad, 3 kids, might be 5 names on the roll, but for the bank, that's 1 giving unit. Okay, so that's part of that conversation, understanding in terms of perspective. But I go back to, again, we have to have all of our financial matters in order, but then also know and understand what is it that we are going to be able to borrow. Because in a project, and I love this, what's the first thing when we start thinking about new construction that we want to do? Give me the honest answer. What's the first thing we want to do? Pastor said we're going to start a building fund. We're going to build a new, whether it's fellowship hall, church sanctuary, whatever it is. What's the first person we're going to hire? Engineer. I would love it if that was the case. I would love that. Thank you. That. Ooh, we both repeat that sentence louder. No, I know. Repeat that sentence. I'm not picking up. Repeat that sentence. But what was the rest of that sentence? No. What was the rest of your architect should be the first. Okay. Now. That's what she said. Brother Perry over here had a different opinion. What was your answer? Engineers. Okay, now, so from my personal view of the world, I will tell you all day, every day, I'm going to hire my engineer before I hire my architect. But we, in general, our first thought process is to hire the architect, okay? So this is a very good part that gets into this education space in terms of thought process. Who gives the architect the budget? Because the architect is going to start with, well, what do y'all want to see happen? We want a sanctuary that seats 2,000. We want a sanctuary that seats 1,000, whatever it is. And he's going to go draw what it is that you say your vision is. Now, Mr. Paul back there might say, I'm looking at your financials, and you can afford a church that seats 500. But now we've written this check over here to the architect to draw this vision now that we need to figure out how we're either going to raise another $500,000 or adjust. So we're going to end up paying him twice because that check's already cleared the bank. Okay? But from a technical standpoint, yes, I'm a very big proponent of engineering. We've got to understand the ground. We've got to understand water, sewer. We've got to understand all those because that's where budgets typically are going to go awry and go bad first. So we start there. But the other thing is, let's start with the metrics, just a basic conversation with a lender. If you're doing church loans, what is your criteria? How do you evaluate it? You know, is it in relation to our existing debt? Is it in relation to how many members? You know, are you going to want to see our top 10 givers? What are the things that they're going to want to see so you can have a better understanding of how much money would he possibly lend, he, she, whoever, before we get to the point of going to draw the vision? Because there's no point of drawing a $2 million vision if the church can afford a $900,000 note. Okay, so I start there, and I'm emphatic about that. And really, even if we're doing something else, if we're talking about an assisted living facility, if we're talking about a daycare facility, if we're talking about affordable housing or market rate housing, we still need to figure out what is it that we can afford to build as it relates to the project. Now, on the development side, commercial development, we're using the assets to help pay, to pay the expenses for what it is. So the project will start answering some of those questions as we go through that process. But I want us to move, and I'm not picking on you. I appreciate you speaking on, please. But I want us to think before we hire the architect, what else do we need information to give them as a part of it? Okay. Question, thoughts, or other issues? And I include the piece about appetite because it is key to understand that different banks and financial institutions underwrite differently. The lease transaction that I referenced earlier with the Montessori school, there are certain financial institutions that don't want to look at that, but they'll look at a church loan. And then there's some that are reversed. They won't look at a church loan, but they'll look at that as a commercial, because they're looking at it as a traditional commercial lease. So simply because this is the other comment I hear all the time, the bank said they don't want to look at it. And so we have to understand what those individual lenders' appetites are and how that relates and corresponds to. Anything from online?
I do. Someone has asked, do you ever see churches perform collaborative projects?
Rarely, but increasingly that's the goal, to do more collaborative projects. So again, that collaborative piece, looking back at the partnerships, I remember a number of years ago, the congressional offices pulled together HUD, USDA, and some others to have a conversation about resources that were available to the faith-based community. And there were two churches in the same community that were talking to the community facilities representative for USDA. Community facilities would be things like a daycare, assisted living, those type of commercial loans. And in the conversation, when one pastor finished, the other pastor talking about what his vision was, he says, well, Pastor so-and-so just left. He's really in the same community. He's talking about that. Yeah, we've spun off from them. We're not part of their church. But you're both asking the same funding source for the same thing. So I think that there is unity of voice, especially when we start talking about being within common municipalities, that whether it's the city of Spartanburg, Spartanburg County, city of Greenville, Greenville County, those folks still have goals and production of what they want to see happen. But if we can bring multiple congregations together to go make a single request, it is easier on them to look at it and say yes. So there are examples. There are, unfortunately, it's more fleeting. And typically they tend to be around the services. Maybe, like I said, I used earlier, whether it's one is providing food bank or some other type of social service, and the other is providing some other type of asset. I just mentioned the assisted living. We're actually looking at, we're having one conversation with one congregation about specifically a new project, but I just referenced a previous one, and actually I've referenced two, one we looked at for church, because it is of size. We do have the memberships that could benefit from it. There are a number of different aspects as to why, from an economic development standpoint, that they're demand generators, meaning when we start to, is this feasible? There's enough market data that says that the population base is there to support it. But depending on where you are, maybe it's daycare, whatever those income generators are that can be substantiated and documented as a part of our financing package. Now I'm about to switch into one of my favorite sermonettes. So before I do that, reactions so far, questions, thoughts, or issues? Concerns? This sounds great, but my church, he don't understand my church. Come on now, share some of those thoughts. Talk to me. If I walk back in and say this, what am I going to run into? We don't have the size of property, we just have one lot. We've got 3 lots. We don't feel like we're in the position to purchase what? Give me your thought, feedback. Yes, sir.
I have a specific question about the assisted living. In this example, did that particular church self-manage or did they
All right.
outsource it?
Okay, so that was actually an independent 501c3 nonprofit. The previous example I gave with the church, they actually decided to not move forward with that. But no, by no means. I will say this: you are going to have, in the assisted living example, very large trouble with the lender signing off on the church self-managing, because part of the underwriting process is going to be who's going to manage this long term. So that's going to be a key piece of that. Yes, ma'am.
How can we guarantee affordable housing for people in Greenville? And what I mean by that is, I think the area median income now is like $62,000 or something a year.
Okay.
And let's just say we have land and we want to be able to build affordable housing, but we're tailoring to those under that annual salary. Let's say $20,000 to $30,000 a year for the restaurant worker or the janitor. And I know with HUD assisted housing, it's 30% of the area median income. But if I understood correctly earlier, as we were talking about median income, it may be different geographically and, I would say the downtown area of Greenville where our church is located. So how can we guarantee that if we build housing there, it will be affordable in the sense of at least the 30% and not necessarily mixed with tax credits and all those other things that makes it more monthly?
Okay. All right. So yes, ma'am.
Just repeat the question before you answer for the live stream folks.
Okay, thank you. So the question, for those on the live stream, I have to remember my friends over here as well. How do we achieve, I'm going to paraphrase, a deeper level of subsidy? If we want to reach 30, 35%, and there are questions about, like I gave some examples at 65%, how do we make sure that we achieve that, that level of subsidy and make it work? All right, so one of the carve-outs that the question included also without tax credits, et cetera. So let me both directly answer that and give you a little bit of FA's view on the world. And this is just my perspective. First of all, making projects work at 65% of the area, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. We use this term AMI, and I'm gonna go a little bit further. Area median income. Do we need to start with defining that first? Don't be shy. Okay, all right, let's all right, this is 2020 income limits. I was really not going to park on this too long, but I'm going to answer your question, but I want to give some context, okay? So, and this was, I believe, Charleston at the time, but for a family of 4, 100% of area median income was $74,000. And you substitute Greenville, whatever those numbers are. If someone can either pull those numbers or tell me those numbers. So for a family of 4 at 100%, we're saying is at $74,000 in 2020. So a family of 2 at $35,000. So at 30% of the area median income, you're talking about serving somebody that's making $21,000 or $22,000 using these numbers. Okay, and you got Greenville? What's Greenville?
For a family of 1, we're looking at 80% of the area median is 47,750. A family of two is 54,550
All right, so 54 is 80% of the area median income
for family of two.
for a family of two. So if I just guesstimate, then 35% of median income would be close to that 22,000. Okay, so somewhere in the 20-some thousand dollars. So if you want to call it service worker, whatever you want, however you want to term that. The challenge is delivering a quality unit, and the rent that structure is going to support. I have the mortgages, I don't have the rents, but the rents that they're going to support is a very tough feat without low-income housing tax credits. So one of the things that from an exposure standpoint, when we think of the federal agencies, what are the first federal agency we think of when we start talking about housing? HUD, okay? Some of us may also think about USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture. But, and I'm going to say it from my standpoint, as a practical matter, one of the largest housing programs, if you will, or influence in housing is actually Department of Revenue, under Internal Revenue Service, is the low-income housing tax credit provision, which in its simplest form, it means that if I have a $100,000 tax liability, say I'm the Wells Fargo, I have a $100,000 tax liability, I could invest in an eligible property and project, and this gets real complicated, and receive a tax credit based on my investment, and that I can then sell those, or we as a project proponent can buy those credits as equity coming into our project. So I can get someone to provide that equity and they get the tax write-off. So let's just try and leave that at 50,000 feet. We could be here 3 hours if we got down a tree level on this, but at 50,000 feet, that is a mechanism. In general, unless a municipality or some entity is so committed to the project to provide the level of subsidy it's going to take to serve someone at 35% of the area median income, it's going to take a tremendous amount of subsidy. Okay, and that is not going to be a very easy request. Would either the two of you disagree with that statement? Okay, because it's going to take a high level of subsidy. So our mission, our goal may be, sorry y'all, that these are the people that we want to serve. But that is going to be a very tough nut to crack. And the other FA-ism here that I'll just share is our government, particularly at the state level, has made it increasingly difficult for the general population to carry out low-income housing tax credit projects by themselves because of the net worth and liquidity requirements and the experience requirements, which this year they just doubled the experience requirements to carry out a LIHTC project, a low-income housing tax credit project. So that right off the rip means that if we want to serve at that threshold, we have to partner with an experienced LIHTC developer in order to make those projects happen. So I'm not trying to pour water, I'm trying to give realism. That's not to say it's not done. I mean, I'm partnering with LIHTC developers regularly, in terms of pursuing projects, both in terms of experience and in terms of total assets and in terms of liquidity. So that is a very defined piece. Having said that, and I know I want to answer that specific question, but we can still achieve our goals. We can still get it. That first house that I said that we start off with, New Israel, the city did make the decision. They just wrote the check. And so you could achieve that. But the next piece is, how do we determine affordability? And I'm going to come back and delve in this a little bit more detail, but I'll make a chart like this and maybe I'll send it out that corresponds to rental. But the point of this chart is to correlate between incomes, the area median incomes, the income levels by household, how much mortgage that they can qualify, and how that corresponds to sales price, and what kind of subsidy is needed to get those folks in the housing. And the same analysis really we can do on the rental side is, it's going to cost us X amount to deliver these units, but in order to serve our target market, we're only going to be able to borrow so much. And the rest has got to come from somewhere. And that somewhere is got to be some type of equity. Which I guess then transitions your question, then leads, did I leave any part of your question unanswered? Okay. Any other correspondence? One from the chat.
From the live stream, we had someone ask, can you address again what the
engineer does.
Ah, all right. So,
And again, if you could just rephrase the question.
sure. The engineer's role and why I put the emphasis on before I hire the architect. Why am I starting with the engineer? Let's say that this is our property and we have, I forget what size this was, 15, 20 acres, whatever that is. Someone has to lay it out. And I just had initial contact with a developer, or a young developer, that is looking to carry out a project, and she hired the architect to do the site layout, meaning to how the conceptual site plan, master plan, how those pieces lay out. And I took a breath and kept my mouth closed and said, we're going to work through, we're going to keep moving forward on this. But my preference is that our conceptual site planning be done by our engineering team, our civil engineers, because they're going to look at getting in and out of the primary road. I say call it ingress and egress. How do we get in and out? How do we transition from our larger commercial structures to maybe something that's a little bit more dense, like quadruplexes to duplexes to single family? And how does all that relate to it? The other thing what the engineers will do is look at capacity of water and sewer. And again, this is another relevant conversation with a client this week. Subdivision was approved for 18 units, and they wanted 18 1-acre lots, and they wanted to come in and put in half-acre lots. But they said the water and sewer was already in place. If we double the number of houses, was the water line put in that can support twice as many houses? I doubt it. But the civil engineer can take a look at that fairly quickly. The engineers can look at that fairly quickly and look at those issues. Sewer capacity. Does the sewer line support that many units? Because what we don't want is sewage backing up into the house, right? Or the property. So the engineer's role is to look at those technical issues of the site. And the reason I say that that becomes so important, there are things like, number one, environmental assessments. Most banks, we're not going to do anything without an environmental phase one that says there's no soil contamination on the property. We as lay people may look at a piece of dirt and just assume it's there. God made it. It's fine. But what are those soils made of? What are the soils composition? Can it support what we're trying to do? So we might have someone from an engineering standpoint drill and take a look at the dirt and do a geotechnical analysis to see, will the soils actually support what we want to do? Particularly if we are in a seismic area that's subject to earthquakes, or if we're in the low country and we've got really wet soils. There are a lot of different things from that standpoint. And those are the things of oops, that, well, there was a house there before, so it'll work. Those are the things that we have to look at. I have one example that I share periodically where existing infrastructure, we were looking at doing some new development. The assumption is that the water lines are sufficient for what we want to do, but we have to verify that. If I did not answer that on the chat, please respond back. So I think I was answering another question here when I skipped. So that's all part of that pre-development. I'm going to talk about that. So again, now I want to shift gears here. Tell me your name again. Ms. Barbara. All right, Ms. Barbara was raising a very good question about affordability and who we're trying to reach and target. All right. How many of us think that we may have an interest in pursuing some grants? Resources for what? Anybody? Just me? Okay. All right. Pursuing grants. Okay. Now, grants then say, this is what we want. We want to produce housing, and these are the requirements to do it. Those requirements I call strings. So those strings might include things such as what? You can apply for $500,000 to carry out this housing project, but what does the grant source want?
They want specifics. They're going to give you specifics to do, and you have to do those specifics.
They're going to give us specifics. And some of that might include who we're going to serve. Who are we going to rent to? Okay, and typically, going back to your point, one of the metrics that they typically will use is area median income. Some of it may be a specific population like veterans housing. They have to be a veteran. Okay, but let's park for a minute on area median income. All right. And oh, I'm sorry, you did ask one other aspect of your question I do want to address. The rules are the rules, but jurisdictions implement them differently. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. Home funds, which is like CDBG, federal funds that come from HUD and go to the cities and municipalities that they then redistribute across the city or county, may say that you have to target a buyer at 65% of the area median income. I have one jurisdiction that applies that on initial occupancy, and after that, it then can go to 80%. I have another jurisdiction that it's 65% for the life of your requirement with us. So we have to know not only what do we start, but long-term, what does that mean? Where am I going with this? All right, why does this matter to us? I start there because very often the conversation I hear is the church has this property, the church has this building, we want a grant to build it, we don't have the money to do it ourselves, okay? And again, now I'm not going to revisit the conversation on capital for those that came in later. Let's go back to the beginning when I'm talking about human capital, social capital, those other aspects. But when we start talking about the money, those strings, those requirements that Ms. Barber referenced have impact. They're not without impact. So I want to talk about one of those right here for a quick moment. We built these 4 units, the blue and the yellow, 2-bedroom down, 2-bedroom up, in the city of Charleston. Those funds, in part, came with federal home funds that the city provided to the nonprofit for the construction of those units. Now, most of those are actually veterans, because again, we're still working with HUD, the local VA hospital, provide the HUD VASH program as the residents. But I took this clip out of the appraisal. The appraiser said his conclusion of those units, as proposed, subject to the rent restrictions, the value was how much? Huh? You can't see it? It's too small? I'm sorry. $670,000. Thank you. Okay? So those 4 units with the city's requirements were worth $670,000. He also concluded, without the rent restrictions, at fair market rent, those houses, those same 2 buildings, were worth $1,020,000. Am I not speaking plain English? All right, 7, 8, 9, over $300,000 difference between as restricted value and unrestricted value. Meaning, if the church could figure out how to build this without the city's help, the buildings would be worth $1 million. But by getting the city's help, it's worth $670,000. Now, how do we define a win? Hey, we have an asset now. We have some houses that are serving 4 veteran families, cash flowing, and it's worth $670,000. That's a win, and I'm not underscoring that. That is a win. That's a nice project, a successful project. But from an asset standpoint, the question that I want you all to think about is the free money worth it? Is the subsidy worth what we might lose in valuation? And it may not be, but that's a business decision that we have to make. Because by serving a lower income individual, it means we're receiving a lower rent rate, which means that our property is worth less. Now, using the previous example I used about the Montessori school, what I did not mention at the time on that was, and I probably should have at the time, but this is a good place to do it. The church took that Montessori school lease and borrowed enough to not only pay what they needed to for that building, but they took all of the church debt and financed it into the school building. So the church is free and clear, and all of the debt all of the church's debt is being paid for by that lease payment that is going to the bank to pay that. Taking the mortgage off the church, that might help the monthly cash flow. Okay? So that's the thought process from why this becomes relevant is, so if Community Works is willing to lend, what do you say, 90% loan to value, 90% of that $300,000 is money that we can't touch. But it may be that that's the only way we get it done, and there's nothing wrong with this deal. I mean, I manage that project. There's nothing wrong with this project, but it's just a thought process, okay? So I use that in comparison to my house for over a decade, that I went to the city and I said, this is not a faith-based project, but I think it makes the point between market value and affordable. And I went to the city and I said, I'll put in the road, water, and sewer, you give me the dirt. Fair enough. I put in the road, water, and sewer, we assigned a value to the land, they transferred the dirt, and we did it. Now, as we began to market it, and we started talking about structured wiring, elevators, $500,000, local council members said, it's not affordable. I said we were doing young professionals. Did I say I was doing affordable housing? That's not what my contracts say. My contracts say we're doing, because that's what the market supported. Now, I'm not saying that the church should carry out just pure economic-driven, market-based development. That's not what I'm saying. I don't want somebody to walk out of here saying FH's trying to get the church. But what I am trying to say is that we do need to make some business decisions, and maybe we do 70-25, 75-25. We do 75 affordable, we do 25, and that's part of the conversation, even on some of these smaller rentals, to getting the churches to say, let's do half the units as affordable housing and half at market rate. Because at the end of the day, at some point, we're going to need a new roof. At some point, we're going to need new HVAC. The church has to have some oxygen itself. It has to make some economics to the church as well. I have frequently say, if anyone of y'all heard me speak before, no money, no mission. And that's got to be where we start, is no money, no mission. I had a church in Asheville, North Carolina, that was doing an amazing after-school program. And they had some property downtown that we were talking about doing some condos with. And when I saw in the paper a couple years later, they shut down the after-school program. And I said, if you'd done the condos, you'd have the cash flow to run the after-school program. So we got to think, what is it that we want to do what we got to do so we can do what we want to do. And I think that kind of corresponds. So that's just my mini sermon on making the business decision of how do we tack into affordable housing piece. And here's the reality. If you go to your city and county representatives and you explain that this project is going to be 60% affordable and 40% market rate, and it's a business decision so that we can make sure that these units stay on the ground, stay in good condition, this is why we need to do it this way. The response is, that's a responsible approach. Yeah, they'd love to say, we got 20 units and they're all affordable, but 20 units all affordable and they're going to look like crap in 10 years, or half and half, and we have enough margin to operate and sustain ourselves. But we have to think about our sustainability, okay? All right. My last piece on sustainability is, and I guess I'm going to show my age because I don't know if they do it quite the same now, but, you know, what was the first thing in part of the pre-takeoff announcements the stewardess used to say? Fasten your seat belts, and in the event of cabin pressure and the mask drop, what do we do? Take care of yourself first. Thank you, sir. Put your mask on before you try and help a child or a senior person do it. Because if you fall out trying to help them get their mask on, you are gone. So from a sustainability standpoint, we have to think about it in terms of our sustainability. If we are going to be here to serve the next generation, we have to be sustainable for where we are, okay? So part of that I want to transition, we're in good shape on time, is start talking a little bit more technical. So far, I'm really just trying to provide relevant examples as to how these can be applied in different situations, whether you have vacant land of a larger scale or individual smaller lots, that the breadth of what you can take on in terms of, you know, 100 units of apartments, assisted living, daycare, individual single housing. The full gamut is yours. It's just based on the will to take on and look at and what makes sense and what we're able to get financed. So I want to talk a little bit more about the technical stuff right now to respond to a little bit further the question about engineering and that sort of thing, talk a little bit more about the technical aspects. But before I kind of transition to the technical pieces, other thoughts? Nothing online either?
Did you say, where, I think you said something earlier about where we can find out, I'm trying to think of the word that you used, to like find out more specifics of what type of,
You can qualify for?
that and like, the properties, like the areas that you can serve, the
Mhm.
different populations, I'm trying to think how you worded it. Say like the veterans
Yes.
versus
Okay.
daycares or.
So, for example, yes, so the question in terms of how do we go about getting some information, and we can include some of those links just as well, but for example, USDA has an eligibility map, depending on how far outside in the county you may be, that you can type in USDA eligibility map and you can pop up, you click on it, put your address in, and it'll say is eligible, is not eligible. You can do a search for new market tax credit eligibility map, boom, and a lot of providers will have it. The good thing about the new markets maps, and I can send the links if you have trouble finding it, just reach out, is they will also outline other criteria that you might qualify for, whether it's an opportunity zone, whether it's a low mod census tract, some of those other pieces so that you can know exactly where you are and whether or not those dollars. Now, just for education, I'm not even going to be at 50. I want to go to 90,000 feet on this. I'm not going to try and get tree level. The new markets piece really is a conversation if you're talking about doing commercial projects. Okay. The opportunity zone piece is really a conversation where we're looking at potential equity investments in certain things. I don't want to drop too far below the ceiling on that. I just want to paint that real broadly because we could park there for quite a while. But I will say this. I would venture to guess that if it shows up as being either new markets eligible or tax credit eligible, the CRA officers, the community reinvestment officers at the banks are probably going to want to have a conversation about the project. Because it's probably going to be a project in the area that they're going to want to take a look at, lending-wise. And the community reinvestment officer, within the bank, there are different departments. There's what I call the retail side of the bank where we go in, the tellers, the branches, that side. There's the commercial lending side where lending to businesses and whatnot. And then there are the compliance people. And the compliance people, are we spending our money in the different segments of the community? And they are looking for different projects that the commercial guys may not necessarily have an appetite for, but it's to the bank's benefit for a whole host of reasons as to why those loans become important. So, we're good? I would be venturing to guess that one of those two searches will get you some of that information. The other thing I will say is, if you look at the city and county website, are there any specific economic overlays that are applicable to your community? Because those are particularly, like, community development department may want to fund projects in master plan areas that they've master planned or part of their comprehensive plan and have an emphasis for those. And if we are located in those areas, then those might be something specifically that people want to serve. Yes, Mike?
I got one from the live stream. What do you believe the market can support, single-family homes for sale or apartments for rent?
So, excellent question in terms of what can the local market support? And that is a question every day, and it's going to vary site by site, location, and geographically. So I'm looking at a project right now that's in the city of Spartanburg that has a lot of rental nearby. And the question becomes, not just existing, but in the pipeline, do you do more of that, or do you differentiate and do something for sale? So part of that conversation is, what is the greatest need? Here's the challenge. When you're looking at a different site or different locations, whether it's Greenville, Spartanburg, the county, what have you, where is the demand? If you see that there are rental units and there are waiting lists, that tells you there's unmet demand, that there's demand that can still be tapped. The challenge becomes you don't want to be the last person without a chair, okay?
I shared my personal project. I sold the first 4 right before the recession hit. I had a colleague that was doing a very similar project a few miles away, and I watched him sit on a $500,000 house through the recession, and every time I passed by and saw the sign was still for sale, I felt for him. That's being left without a seat. And I'm not saying we're getting in a $500,000 cent, but I'm saying we don't want to miss the market. And that is the key piece, is understanding what is your local market. I had one of the county officials, I asked them for money to do a for sale project, and they had another nonprofit that was doing a for sale project. They had to turn to rental because they could not find a buyer. The problem wasn't that there weren't buyers for the house. The problem was the house didn't fit the market. And so that's a very specific answer to the question in terms of rental versus for sale. Certainly rates are moving right now, so the number of people that are qualifying for certain houses is shrinking, but there's still so much demand and there's still so much of a lack in supply. Ms. Franklin, thoughts, comments on for sale supply versus demand?
My thoughts is rates are increasing. Rates are anticipated to increase again this year. We're going to have to be creative with financing.
Getting creative with finance. Okay. So, so that's, I know that's not a clear-cut answer of A versus B, but it really is going to depend on where you are, what you're pursuing, and from that standpoint. And it really is market-based. Yes, ma'am.
For those, can you speak to, for those that are looking at rentals, the pros and cons of a long-term hold of rentals versus having an exit strategy in place?
Okay. From a development standpoint, what is our goal and objective? Are we trying to, say, a fix and flip kind of scenario, get it rented and sell it in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? What is our long-term exit strategy? Or are we trying to hold it for the long term? So when it comes to, from a faith-based standpoint, that comes back to what is our goal and objective? Are we trying to control the assets in our neighborhood? And so we want to hold it for the long term? Or do we believe that once we get it stabilized, we've created the equity and we can turn around and sell it? Now, if in fact, I will say this, if in fact, to Ms. Melanie's point, your goal and objective is a shorter term hold, I ask you to please remember this slide and think about what that means in terms of any subsidies that we use and how long they're going to be there and when do they fall off and how do they fall off. Because once those requirements fall off, our values are most likely going to increase and probably increase substantially. And so that will factor into what our hold is. Now, jurisdictions are getting longer with their requirements. And so it may be that, in the past you could get away with a 8-year or 10-year hold. I'm not really, do you know what City of Greenville, for example, is doing in terms of compliance period? Any idea of what they're doing in terms of compliance period right now for, say, rental, if they put money in a project?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay. 30 and 40? Okay, yeah. So it's, all right, so I have one representative says, getting longer, like 30 or 40 years. So part of that really starts to factor in. I will tell you, in the city of Charleston, those obligations are getting longer and longer, and they're actually longer than 20 and 30 years. In terms of some of those requirements, which becomes a very much an operational issue where you have to park reserves for repairs. You got to put it in the budget. It's too easy to say we're getting $5,000 a month and our mortgage is $4,000 and we're netting $1,000 a month or whatever that math is. You've got to take off the top. We need to park $250 a unit or $100 a unit or whatever that number is for the rainy day when the roof is out, the HVAC is out. We have to park those reserves in as a part of our budget. It's not free ball, it's not free money, and it's just there. We've got to put it in a separate bank account, and that the membership knows and understands that that's what these dollars are for. Okay, and we have to insist on that. But to Ms. Melanie's point, that is a key piece when we start the project. What is our long-term position and what is our goal? Are we trying to create a long-term revenue stream? Or are we just trying to do good in the neighborhood and we want to try and sell it? And that's going to frame the way that we finance it. Okay?
So pre-construction or pre-development. There's a lot that has to happen before we see a foundation being poured, before we see a bulldozer on site. And depending on what needs to happen in terms of rezoning, approvals, that could very well be a 6, 9, or 12-month process, maybe even longer in certain circumstances. Now, for you all, that presents a couple problems. Number one, naysayers. Anybody in here got naysayers in the congregation? No? No. I'm not, Pastor been talking about this project for 12 months. Didn't he talk about this last year? I don't see nothing happening. Okay? So laying those expectations to create the understanding that it's going to take us 9 to 12 months, might as well start off long, 12 months to figure out how big, how high, how wide, how much. Just in plain English. Is that talking plain enough? Okay. We need 12 months to figure out how wide, how big, how high, how much. Okay. Set that expectation in the beginning. You are not going to see a bulldozer next month. Okay. We've got to have that as a foundational piece because we have to have our who working? Miss Barbara? Thank you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. All right. So we're going to have our engineers out here looking at, you know, the minutia, the level of minutia that you all never want to get into, but that's what part of my job. Is this a city road, a county road, a DOT road? Who owns the road out there? Why does that matter? Who do I need to get approval to put in a driveway, a curb cut, all of those things? And if it's DOT, are they going to make me do a traffic study if my project's big enough? All of those level of minutia of, you know, what needs to happen. Stormwater. Am I going to have to dig a detention pond? You know, you see an apartment complex, you see the large area with the fence around it, and how big does that have to be? And by the way, just FYI, because I just had this conversation this week. We bought this, it was already approved. When was it approved? Because guess what? Those stormwater requirements going to change. And if you don't have a live building permit and you bought it and someone sold it to you like, oh, all you got to do is start construction. Yeah. There's a reason they didn't start that project. Okay. And so, you know, all of those things, getting those things, civil, mechanical, electrical. My dad used to tell me, dig a foundation, that's engineering. Water and sewer, that's engineering. Heating and air is engineering. Somebody then gets to cover it all up and make it look pretty. And I'm not beating the stew out of architects, but I'm just trying to say these technical pieces on the front end, soil borings, all those issues of how we do it are the things and the questions we want to know on the front end as best we can. And there's a short-term piece where we try and spend as little money as we can up front to figure out the basics. One is to validate the market that does what we're thinking make sense? Will what we think fit on the site physically? And so we start with a pretty picture, okay? And then somebody takes this pretty picture, starts putting math to it to say, how much is it going to cost? How much can we borrow and figure that out? And we start drilling down further into the detail. So you got a 20 or 50 acre site. What's the big picture? So one of my favorite examples, because this is not going to be any of you all, right? Church owned, I forget how many acres, but it was a rectangular site. They didn't know me. They bought the property, and the first thing they wanted to do was build what? Come on, talk to me. No, well, that is another company. But the church. They want to build a church. Where on this piece of paper did they build the church? Who said that? Right here in the center. Then they came to me and said, we want to do some senior housing. Okay. So the church is here because Pastor said, when you drive up right down the road, you're going to see the steeple of the church. And they say, well, why don't we want to do some senior housing? We want to put it right down here. Engineers take a look. This is wetlands. Long story short, there's nothing I can do for you. I'm showing my age. Flavor Flav said, nothing I can do for you, man. So the problem is what should have been parking, the wetlands, wasn't used that way. And so your developable part of the property, so a third of the property I'm using round numbers, was not buildable. But they did not master plan the site based upon what the site issues were. So we jump out and start looking at the components of what we want to do and how could they physically fit on the site before we start construction on any given component. Do we want our retail up at the front of the street? Yeah, that makes sense. Then how do we provide our access? Yes, sir.
So I have another one from the live stream here. Someone asked specifically for a nursing home or a health facility / mental health facility. What would be the best beginning strategy?
The best beginning strategy is, number one, is I would determine, does the church have the physical space for it? Meaning, is this going to be a church that has existing land that they can build it on, as opposed to having to go out and buy land to fit it on? So I think from a faith-based standpoint, it's easier if you have the existing assets of the land as a beginning point. The other is just to do a real brief gut check of, what's happening with some of the other facilities in the market. If you just got through hearing Sister Jones say that Mama was discharged from the hospital and it took them however long to find a rehab facility for them to placement, and the demand is so high, that gives you an idea that there's high demand. Or if you're trying to place someone in a long-term assisted living facility and you see that the facilities are mostly full, even without a formal market study, you can kind of just gut check of, well, what's happening here locally? Now, at some point, your bank's going to want a formal market study, and there are ways to kind of phase into that. You can do, I'll sometimes do the demand side of it as a entry point to pay for before I pay for the full-blown study, just to make sure that I do think that there's enough demand before I go get full. So before you get into a full market study, I would say just kind of make some phone calls yourself just to kind of get a feel that does that really make sense. It's because you're not spending any money doing it that way. But at some point you're going to need a full market study to back it up. But number one, I think, is do we have the resources space-wise to do it? Do we agree that is it just my idea? This is not if we build it, they will come, is what I'm saying. We need to make sure that we got the idea that there is a backup for that. And then I think we need to start thinking about who's going to operate it, and is there a partner that we can partner with in terms of operations? So if that did not answer that question, please put another question back in the chat and I'll respond back to it. Yes, ma'am.
Another question from the live stream group. Can you discuss the pros and cons of a nonprofit developing condos instead of developing apartments or single family?
Wow. A nonprofit developing condos versus single family versus apartments. The most honest answer right off the rip, I'm going to say, is really the local market. I mean, that's really has to be the point of beginning. But then again, it comes back to Ms. Melanie's point is, what is the individual church's strategy though? Because if it's maintaining the long-term ownership of it, then that would lean toward that if the market's there for multifamily. Now, the condo versus, I'm going to say the single family piece of it really is going to also just depend on where you are. I mean, because that's going to be a market-based decision. If you're downtown Greenville, I mean, that might be more self-explanatory that that's more of a condo market based on where you are, as opposed to when you're in the suburbs, that's going to be more geared toward single-family detached or townhouse type development. So owner appetite, number one, is I think the first threshold. The second is what's immediately surrounding the property. Now, I will say there's an example, and I'm afraid to call the neighborhoods because I may not get it correct, but in Greenville, adjacent to Sterling, I guess if you're going to the west, I forget what the adjoining community is, but the developer is basically creating their own market because as they purchased all the vacant land and they've assembled block after block, what is currently now vacant, and you look across the main street, you see what they're getting ready to do in terms of higher density development. But they have, in essence, assembled all of the single family for like 3 blocks, and I cannot think of the sub-community right off the top of my head, but I mean, I looked at it maybe not even 6 months ago, but I can tell that they're about to completely reknit the fabric of that neighborhood, because it's not going to be single family detached, because they now have 3 or 4 blocks. It's going to be high density condo. But do we have the bandwidth for that type of long-term acquisition, demolition hold that that particular developer has? And so that's where that's why I'm saying that where we are is going to determine what that product looks like. Okay. So creation of the business plan, again, what is it we're going to do? Putting that in place, because one of the things that communities of color I tend to see happening is people want to come and tell you about the vision, but not be able to hand you a document. I think I have had 3 churches that in my initial meeting, they said, here's our plan, and hand me an actual document that said, we want to do veterans housing, we want to do this, we want to do that. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say maybe 3 churches that they want to articulate what it is, what we have. But taking the time to write it down and put it on a sheet of paper is mission critical as a part of that process. So all of that, for those of you who are visual learners, let's look at it this way. All of these different elements, we want to end up here in construction, but before we get to construction, this feasibility and master planning piece of it, design, architecture, engineering, again, I show my prejudice. Who's up front? Who's up top? I got my, So, but all of those different components, looking at where we are from a cost estimation standpoint, all of those different pieces. And one element I have not touched on yet, but this is a good piece. Never mind the technical piece. Let's talk about approvals. Who in here represents what I call a connectional church? Connectional church.
What is a connectional church?
Typically your AMEs, your Presbyterian, meaning that you are connected back to a church body. Okay, so, all right, so now, okay. The reason I asked that question, I hadn't talked about that yet, because it is great to have the idea and we get to the point and you don't have the authority to pledge the collateral because the presiding elder, the bishop, the connectional church is not given the authority and approvals through the process down. And so depending on the organization, those are other issues, which is why I at least just put the local church conference as a part of that conversation, is who else is part of the meeting as part of that. Because when you have a loan commitment that's fixed or a purchase agreement that's fixed time, we don't have time to then go back and call church conference at the regional or state level based on, in terms of approvals we need. Laugh now. When there's money on the table, it's not. But I just talk because these are just real issues and struggles what we look at. So, I share that as a graphic representation of what that development process looks like and feels like. But all these different issues is just another way. This is a site plan that we looked at where we were looking at a property. This is an existing building which we knew as a third rail, not an option. We are not going to demolish this. It's a historic building. It has to stay as part of the site. There was another building over here we could demolish, and we looked at about 5 different iterations of, retail space, residential space, smaller residential. We looked at some some assisted living as a part of development, just different iterations of what that site could look like. This is just one of the versions, but going through that and just looking at what I call constructability, what really makes sense and what is it that we can do to maximize the site. Again, from an engineering standpoint, oftentimes what's going to be the 2 of the biggest drivers, if you will, in terms of physical space is parking, water detention, especially in an urban area. I'm not talking about out in Greenfield where you're starting from scratch, but when you're reknitting the fabric of a community, those are the things that start to become constraints. I'm trying to do a mixed-use building, not as a faith-based project right now. There's commercial space and 6 units, and the biggest constraint right now that is killing me is parking requirements.
There's just not that much from a parking standpoint to get there as a part of it. So all those site ingress, egress we talked about, underground tank removal, that's going to be a whole nother conversation. But I think most of these we've already really talked about. But again, all those different issues and thoughts. Questions? These are the reasons and the discussions as to why that becomes a process. Never mind before we actually get to the process of submittals for city and county approvals. Okay. So before I leave pre-construction, the technical piece, the aspect of getting projects approved, I want to switch and start talking about our partners and financing and actually, how do we get queued up to approach, whether it's Community Works, another lender, those types of things. But these are the things of what I call that pre-construction piece. I just want to make sure people are kind of settled on those level of details. Other questions before we leave that? Ms. Katie, anything else from the chat? No? Okay. All right. I started off the conversation about partners. We referenced some of the relationships that Pastors has developed with a couple of the hospitals that are providing some master leases or providing HUD-VASH vouchers and occupants. But other partners are local community development departments of the cities and counties who, as a part of their mission, want to look at unsafe structures being demolished, lead-based paint hazards, other type of housing counseling, providing both rental housing and home ownership as a part of their core mission. So there are others who have core missions that might align with what we're trying to do. And those are the people that we want to have as a part of our conversation, that we want to approach as potential partners. That's just one. I mentioned USDA, I've mentioned the hospitals, but what I want to do is just give, this is one department's mission, if you will, or goals and objectives in terms of what they're doing, to see how that then correlates to what our goals and objectives. Now, we already kind of had a little bit of conversation on affordability. What is the definition of affordable housing and what does that mean? So I want to talk in two different pots about the definition of affordable housing. On the individual level, let's come over here and talk about the individual, the person, the body. Is a homeowner or a renter house cost burdened? Are they spending more than 30% of their revenue on their shelter? That is a key fundamental policy question issue, from just basic living. Is that housing affordable to that person? There are professionals that argue whether or not transportation should be included in that, because in communities that are high-cost communities where people are having to commute 45 minutes in to work because they can't afford to live near where they work, that is part of their housing attainability. So that is one component or view of affordable housing is, are they rent burdened or are they house burdened as it relates to that? Because what we as a church don't want to do is put people in housing where they are house cost burdened and they're struggling. Because one sick child, one car repair, and they're in trouble, okay? Then there are the things that Community Works and the cities talk about, affordable housing in terms of who we're serving. And this comes back to what we talked about earlier, 100% of median income versus 80%. And there's so many different terms. We hear workforce housing, which tends to kind of start to fall in, maybe they're above 80%, but they're not really above 100% of median income. Certainly low income, typically we're going to start talking about below 80% or 65% of median income. But really we're looking at what does it relate to in terms of keeping their housing costs affordable, okay? Yes, ma'am.
I know there's some landlords in Greenville now that are not utilizing the 30%, that some people, it might be 40%, things like that. Is that a trend? Because it's really difficult for some people, workforce to bring home, to have
The money.
times, their income in order to rent a place. If they're renting it for $1,000, they gotta show $3,000 income to bring it home.
Yeah, and that's just even from the initial vetting. I'm sorry. For those of you listening, the question, let me see if I can rephrase it, is 30% still realistic? Some owners, landlords are looking at 40%,
And the example that if you're looking at a rent of $1,000 a month and someone having to show $3,000 a month in income, that's a very real conversation, and those numbers move up. Now again, let's just take something completely different as a point of perspective. I mean, I remember when the norm was paying for a car in 3 years. From affordability. Then it went to 5 years. And now some people from 6, 7 years to pay for a depreciating car. So as the price points continue to stretch beyond ability to pay, then the financing then starts shifting into how do we still capture that buyer? And so, you look at that, and so it's not surprising then to hear that, okay, well, we can't use 30% because we're not going to have anybody in there. But especially if you're talking about a single parent household and now 40% of the income is going to housing, that's going to hurt. And so from a policy standpoint, I think that the primary metric still is at 30%, but from a private sector standpoint, when people are underwriting is to make sure that they're not having to chase people, are they pushing that number up just to make sure that they're able to get people in there, and then that's going to become a conversation you're going to have with the property management people who are managing your properties is what are we going to allow and what are our target goals and objectives and how we're going to do that, because I think those become real issues and conversation points about what the policy is, what we're going to allow. I think it's a very real issue. So workforce housing, so if someone earns too much to qualify for a housing subsidy but not enough to afford a home or apartment, y'all, there are people who are making a choice to pass up a promotion because it means that some of the benefits that they're getting now they'll lose by that marginal, because the amount of income that they need without that assistance is so much more that without a substantial increase, folks would rather just stay where they are economically. And that's just a realism, okay? So, what does it take in terms of qualifying for some of these subsidies, and if someone actually has a need for that? And that's so who are we serving becomes a key question and a part of that. So that's why I want to have that conversation about workforce housing, affordable housing. And then, so I guess before I transition out of this and start getting to another broader conversation, I guess let me have another FA-ism, if you will, about the realities of what's happening in the affordable housing industry. Terminology is changing, and I am an active member of the chamber. And when I'm chamber functions, I follow the line, and the conversation is not about affordable housing, it is about attainable housing. Now, this is, Community Works, this is my opinion. These are code words that get away from perceptions of who we're serving, because affordable housing creates certain perceptions of who we're serving. And we say attainable because it's a little bit easier to say, okay, we're talking about workforce and teachers and firefighters and what I say this expression about people who push us around a gurney in a hospital, and it's not viewed from a color lens, but and so we have to look at how we phrase things to get someone's attention based on trying to achieve. And so if me getting access to resources mean that I speak in terms of housing attainability, I will talk about housing attainability. But really, can someone between 81% and 120% of median income still afford housing when they may not qualify for state or federal assistance? And how deep can we get those subsidies? So anyway, that's me getting into my opinion on stuff, and I'm gonna end that commercial from my opinion and get back to, but that, I also put that, what I said, education, inspiration, and transformation. I still think that has to be part of how we think and look at things, is how is it that we're going to go after and what we're trying to achieve. All right. I'm getting a little bit from, I'm sorry?
A lot of your opinion is historical.
It is, amen. A lot of my opinion is based on what I've seen. That's correct. It's historical. That is a fair statement. So we've got about 45 minutes together. I want to make sure that we've got time for us to have conversation. I still have a fair amount that I want to at least make sure we touch on. But a few basic terms here that I just want to start kind of walking through and thinking about. Hopefully you've already heard this so far as I've had this conversation when I start talking about other people. Question? Other people who can assist us, whether that's Community Works, whether that's the local city community development department, whether that's a local hospital, whether that's some other service provider. The fancy word for that is a stakeholder. Anybody that can help us or hurt us. Who else can we get in this seat with us to help us be an advocate and a proponent for what it is that we're trying to do? I have a project right now that I got a phone call yesterday I was not very happy about a stakeholder that showed up. I'm looking at a multifamily project that I was actually going to call you about. But someone else has shown up at the table, and it's like taking some Geritol. I didn't want to taste it. But their relationship with the local municipality, I said, let me meditate and think on it for the next weekend, and I'll get back to you on Monday. I don't want them at the table, but they got a relationship with the municipality. Okay, so these are real conversations. Okay, this is based in experience. Okay, so when I say someone can help her, I mean, and so we'll see. Well, I'll let you know how that comes out. But strengths and weaknesses is a part of our own assessment. I've very genteelly tried to touch on in realism about some of our own weaknesses. Okay, from the church's standpoint, our weaknesses typically tend to be our financials, our committee process. Those are the types of things that we have to be honest about ourselves and look in the mirror and say, how can we be proactive and address that? Let's get our reporting together. Yes, we are going to have to go back to Reverend Miller's point. We're going to have to trust a core leadership. We're going to have to vest these 5 trustees with the ability to make a decision. Because I have walked into a meeting of the stewards and the trustees, and there's 40 people in the room and 40 opinions, and how in the heck are we going to make a decision on whether or not we're going to move forward or not? So we have to be realistic about our weaknesses and figure out how to address those. Yes, ma'am.
I think maybe to go back partly to the chamber conversation, but also part of your organizational team building. Does pastors partner and work with the Black Chamber of Commerce?
We have not specifically worked with the Black Chamber of Commerce. I'm not aversion to that. It's just that has not just been a partner to it. But I certainly welcome the connection with any agency or group. We have partnered with Madam Vice President, NARAB, National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the largest and oldest minority real estate trade association in the U.S. So you represent North and South Carolina, correct? Okay, we have worked together with NARAB, I will say that, from a minority standpoint, and I'm sure there are others, but that just comes to mind. But yes, we are open to that. Barriers, certainly we've talked through some of the technical things from a barrier identification standpoint in terms of things that are hurdles, whether that's zoning. Matter of fact, just quick story. Owner has been on me for like the last 6 or 9 months about helping them do a small multifamily building of about 6 or 8 units. And their site size fits, they have additional property adjacent to it that they don't want to include in this development. But it fits another commercial apartment building that is about 10 blocks down. That's like, I like that project. I want to do this project here. And he wants me to go out on site and show that it physically fits. I can look at the GIS. I can look at it from my desk and see, yes, that building fits. But the problem is they got a different zoning than you do. That's the fundamental difference. Their zoning allows for it. Your zoning don't. But you can walk there, but the zoning is different. That's barrier identification. All right, so we already touched earlier about testing the market, and as I was responding to the question in the chat, at some point we do have to do some type of formal market assessment, but y'all know your community. You know what's happening. You know what the needs are. Your gut tells you. And so can we then just do our own assessment preliminary just to kind of fact check does this make sense? I call it back of the napkin. Just trying to look at it and see if it makes sense. And then if it makes sense to us, then we can then move forward. My problem or challenge is when I have people who want to do a project and the heart and the vision, and then they say, well, I don't know, we'll get a grant to figure out how to pay for it. No, it's got to make sense. It's got to be sustaining. I'm not saying that you don't pursue the grant to lower the cost, but you the vision can't just be somebody's going to drop out of the sky and drop money on us and make it happen. Okay? We have to think about that on the front end. How is it we're going to maintain and keep it? So I think I'm going to go back to between Miss Barbara and Miss, is it Angela? No, Miss Anya. Anya. Yes. I apologize. Some of the conversations earlier. When we get into, if we decide to get into the affordable housing space, and again, I'm not promoting or pushing, I just know that that tends to be a hot button issue about what we want to achieve. There's an alphabet soup of things that we just have to get comfortable with in terms of terminology, so we have the conversation with the different entities that we want to have. Again, one of my early sermonettes that I'm going to harp on real quickly, being a nonprofit is a tax status. Repeat after me. Being is a tax status. That's it. And when I say that's it, if you're thinking about forming a nonprofit, you are forming a business. Go ahead and write it. I am forming a business. Okay? Thank you. At the end of the day, we would prefer for our revenues to exceed our expenses. And we're going to have to demonstrate that before we walk into Community Works and say, we want $500,000 to do this project. We are not going to lead with, I'm a nonprofit. This is a nonprofit project. This is an affordable housing project. Yes, the mission for making this project work is that it is an affordable housing project, and the mechanism of how I'm going to get the subsidies is based on the fact that we have a tax exempt status, or we're partnering with a nonprofit, be it Pastors Inc. or someone else who can provide and there are nonprofits like Coastal Community Foundation who will be a financial intermediary for projects that they're supporting. And I probably shouldn't call them specifically, but there are others that even if you don't necessarily have it, and Pastors does that into a limited degree, that we're engaged in a project. But again, that is simply the tax status. We are still approaching this from a business perspective. And by the way, walking into the state of South Carolina Secretary of State and filing articles of incorporation does not mean that you have a nonprofit. It means you have a non-stock corporation that's been filed at the state, and you still cannot apply to the city, to the county, to HUD until you get that IRS letter that says you are a 501c3. So when people say, I've got my nonprofit, and they slide me their state incorporation, I say, that's real nice. Come back when you got your IRS letter. Okay. CDCs, community development corporations, at the simplest level, a nonprofit that is engaged in community development as one of its primary mission and activities. That then can go into a little bit deeper water of, is the board set up as a publicly accountable entity, meaning 1/3 of the board is elected by neighborhood group or low-income representation or lives in low-income neighborhoods and has achieved this designation as a community housing development organization, or CBDO, Community Business Development Organization. I may have slightly missed that one. But those are simply specific designations that HUD or cities or states will give a specific CDC, nonprofit 501c3, as a separate status or designation, not status, as a separate designation. And why does that matter? Because at the city and county level, the cities and counties have to spend 15% of their home funds on CHODOs, Community Housing Development Organizations. And to be real blunt, pre-pandemic, leading into pandemic, a lot of CHODOs went out of business. And so, because they weren't running as a business, and so they're no longer around. And so right now, a number of municipalities are struggling to find CHODOs to spend that 15% of their money. So if it's, I don't want to try and do the math off the top of my head, but if it's $2 million a year they get from HUD, 15% of that has to go to CHODOs. Okay, so it means we still have to have viable projects, but again, those are just specific designations. Community Development Block Grant, Home Investment Partnerships, HOPWA, housing opportunities for people with AIDS. Those are just other federal funds. And just as a sidebar, the relationship that we just forged with Roper St. Francis in Charleston was based on HOPWA funding because it's not been it was underutilized, and there were dollars that were sitting there, and we had a housing project, and there are only 2 people in the city that can apply for the money because there are only 2 HOPWA providers in the city. And so I said, we got real estate expertise, you got access to money. So we signed a memorandum of understanding, which is a contract, if you will, a loose contract, as a part of how you go get the money, we'll provide the housing. And again, from a lending standpoint, it also allows us, when we go to finance the rest of it, to say, here's how we're going to pay for this, because we have this agreement in place. Now, in terms of communities of color, historically, maybe not today, but a grant, at the point in time that it is written, there are no terms for repayment. You use it for the eligible use, you show that you've used it, and the primary way that you might end up paying it back is you don't do what you said you're going to do, and you pay it back. Deferred forgivable loan means, oh no, I trust you. You look kind of shady. So I'm going to give you this money, but I'm going to put note and mortgage on your property until I see you do what you say you're going to do. And then over time, I'll forgive it 1/10 a year for the next 10 years. So at the end of 10 years, I'm just picking with you. Okay. So deferred forgivable, it will at the end, we do what we say we do, become a grant. But on the front end, it's secured by a note and mortgage. And why do I say that? Because from a church standpoint, when it becomes time for the church secretary to sign that mortgage, y'all said this was a grant. Sister Mary, we not write no checks, read it. We sign a note and mortgage, but the church is not paying any money on this. Only if we don't do what we say we do we have to. Okay. Now, again, from experience, I've gotten to closing, and the resolution from the church said that the church secretary was going to sign this note and mortgage, and she got in the lawyer's office and freaked out and left, and we had to go back, call another church conference, and vote somebody else to go sign all the rest of the paperwork. Yeah. Huh? Trust.
I mean, if she hadn't been ignorant walking in, she would have been.
So education is, I keep emphasizing education, but it is an educational process, because part of the challenge is, if I'm signing on behalf of pastors, I sign as development director for Pastors Inc. It doesn't mean that I'm personally guaranteeing the note. It doesn't mean that it's going to show up on my credit report. It means I am the designated officer of the organization that is signing for the property. And sometimes that distinction can be like, wait a minute. Now, I will say this too. I've also seen folks sign church loans in their own names too. All right, grant. We good on grant, deferred loans? Okay, we good there? Okay. But you see why I emphasize that, because it sounds real straightforward, but it's something that we have to be prepared to address. Pre-development risk. All right, so let's just have real plain talk. I'm going to try and accelerate this. The most risky in a project is pre-development. Now, I heard Community Works say earlier, they will provide us with pre-development dollars, but when they do, they want to know who's taking them out, because that is the most risky money. So what does that mean? Brother Johnson, we got this house, we got this property, we have this land, we've got this acreage, and we want to develop it. Well, creating that site plan is not free nor cheap. So having someone to draw it out, and I've actually, another real story, had a church where someone actually within the church took like a PowerPoint and GIS and started drawing boxes and laying out the master plan for the church. Because we're saving money. I have a very smart perspective on life sometimes. But But that pre-development dollars, they are risky. You're not going to get it back if the project blows up. So we have to figure out game plan A, game plan B, and what is our game plan if A and B don't work out. So, but I will say this, typically from a church standpoint, and I do not know why this is, we don't have a problem jumping out and buying the property. But then when it's time to do something with it, we tend to hit these roadblocks, okay? But we have to look at some of this preliminary assessment, but that is the most risky money, and it is pricey, you know, which is why, you know, let's see what we can physically do. Let's gut check the market based on our own ability to kind of look around and see what makes sense before we pay for the market study. But figuring out, which goes back to why, and I guess from a context, I made the example, like that house I showed you all that Pastors has done in different jurisdictions, because we know what it's going to cost to build it. We know what size it is. And we can look at setbacks and we can figure, so we're not having to spend a whole lot of money on the front end. Same thing with that prototype of that quadruplex. Now that that's designed and done, I'm looking at that in different places, different localities. Can I do 4 of them on a site to get economies? I've spent the money. So now can I recycle that same money and use that to lower my cost to do my next assessment? So that's a key piece, but pre-development dollars are the most risky. Yes, my favorite topic, price and cost. Price and cost are not synonymous. They are not the same thing. We use the word, you can ask me, Brother John, how much does it cost to hire you? Or how much does it cost to hire an architect? How much does it cost to pay for a market study? How much does it cost? What's the real question you're asking? How much money am I going to have to pay? What is the sticker price? And I will just leave it with you here. I will not take a 5 or 10 minute diversion, but I promise you, please encourage your fellow church leaders, your fellow clergy. Do not make decisions based on the price tag. Understand what that price tag is paying for. Us in real estate, we call that the scope of work. In construction, we call that the scope of work. If you go out and say, somebody at the bank says you need a geotech on this soil to see, we need a soils report. Okay, and you go ask 3 firms for a soils report, $1,200, $2,000, and $3,500. Oh, we're going with this $1,200. Do not make the decision based on the sticker price. Read those 3 proposals and see what it is and how they are doing it. And if you don't understand how they're doing it, find somebody who does and have them read it, the scope of how it is they're going to do. Because if you already know you're in a sandy clay area and they're going to drill 5 feet for $1,200, I can tell you right now, you're going to have to go ahead and drill 10 or 15 feet to see what those soils look like or whatever as a part of the scope of what I'm saying is a more detailed scope. And guess what? Here's the beautiful thing. That $1,200 report is going to include as their conclusion, I can tell you right now before you pay for it, a recommendation for another geotech report to go another 5 feet down. By then, you're pregnant. You've spent money with these folk. And no need to change your gears. Well, I'm going to go to Melanie now. You already done spent $1,500 over here. You're going to finish this course out. So I say that, and I mean that with all my heart. Price and cost are not the same thing. We have to understand the scope. And I don't care what the subject is, I can apply the same example. I use an example. I hired a contractor to put in a water line, and he was $8,000 cheaper than the next lowest bid. And I promise you, I really wish I had gone with the next bid up. Okay, after he busted the sewer's main line. Okay, so price and cost, that's one of my biggies, and I'm gonna leave it there. I'm not gonna part of it. All right, we've already talked about, and you know, it's an amazing thing, how the times are changing, that we've gone from 25 to 30, and now we're talking about going from 30 to 40. So the other thing, strings. I talked about strings in terms of who we serve, but I'm glad this is another point. He who has the money makes the rules. Okay, we talked about who we're serving, but what are other strings that come with money? If you're talking about federal money, then we're talking about procurement. I know that Brother Jones got a contracting license in the church, but we got federal money in this project. We got to go through a procurement process. What you mean Brother John can't build it? We got a contractor in the church because we have to follow a procurement process and document how we select. Monitoring. Guess what? In 12 months, somebody's going to ring, ding, ding, doorbell and say, we need to take a look at the books and make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do. And we need to report and we need to certify that the people are in fact eligible based on the criteria. So all of those other items and things that come along with it. Again, so I gave you the financial piece in terms of appraisal, but these are the technical piece and there are others. But again, just trying to frame, this is not the universal definition, but I'm just trying to, we say we're trying to create a high level of understanding because I want you proficient enough to ask the right questions because I am a firm believer that I say it all the time, if we ask the right questions, we end up in the right result. So I just want you all to be able to say, the water's deeper than what you think it is. So when your colleagues say, oh, all we have to do is just, the water is deeper than you think it is, okay? This money we spend on pre-construction is going to save us later from surprises, okay? So what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? When? Oh, control. Now, is there anything that someone is willing to share publicly, generally speaking, in terms of a desired type of activity that you all represent that you would like to see? Is that multifamily, single family, detached? I mean, other than, don't say we want to do affordable housing. We're talking like under 5 units, more than 10 units. Give me some parameters. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any projects in South Carolina that are targeting SROs, single room occupancy? Because I know in Greenville there are a lot of people that their income is basically SSI, $840 a month. And some of these people are homeless right now, sleeping outside in cars because there's no way that they can afford rent. And if you get on an income base, there's a waiting list. So I know some people have talked about the fact that sometimes people don't need an apartment. They just need a small room.
Yeah. All right, so SRO, just repeat, means single room occupancy as a type of housing. Does someone need a full apartment? Are there other ways of achieving it? You know, there's a concept of, which is bigger than SRO, but tiny houses. There are different aspects of how we tack into it. You know, are there some former hotel sites that might be able to adapt into some SROs and where the money is to find it? You know, we pastors just literally responded and was awarded, state just put out mental health dollars for some of their projects, and that just concluded, and we were one of 3 or 4 folks who were selected as a part of that. But again, very tight parameters, very tight, not a whole lot of leeway, but for that type of project, it might be feasible. So, you know, other aspects of how we can provide SRO type housing, and that's another piece of, you know, from a church or a faith-based standpoint, it's a little different conversation as to say, we're going to do 200 square feet and that's what we're doing, you know, what have you. I mean, and I'm just picking that as a round number, but that's part of that conversation internally of what is it that we're taking on, that if that's a space that we want to fulfill. But there is a need and demand there. And so when you start talking about following the demand, you can't, those numbers are incontrovertible. Nobody can argue with those numbers that they're there and the people are there. So can we align the resources, which can be tough, you know, but can we align the resources to go after those? So that is another, I appreciate you mentioning that. That's another segment of the market. Somebody asked earlier about condos, but you know, SRO is another piece. No one's really brought up retail development yet, but so I'm not going to park there, but that is another very viable component is retail development. And something that we should not necessarily exclude, especially when you have those of you who have larger acreage, that might be something you can do along the main frontage, road frontage, is retail development. The other, which I go back to when we talk about the faith-based, the new church development, is maybe instead of the church being the prominent feature, maybe it's behind the retail as a part of that as a way of cutting down. But see, I tend to approach stuff from a business standpoint of how can I use other people's money to pay for something. That's just the way that my mind
is wired and worked. I mean, my first house, $40,000 two-family flat. I will tell you all day, every day. My mortgage was $525 and the tenant paid $375. So being 22 to live the life at $100 a month for housing costs, you know, I mean, so we can take that same philosophy and apply it church-wide, is my point why, like I'm sure the pastor's office, that we can look at how we leverage those assets in terms of how to free up cash flow. So, all right, we talked about the vision. We've talked about the inspirational side of here are tangible projects that have been done that you can do that are attainable. We've talked about the technical piece of an intro level conversation on development. Okay, now let's try and use our remaining time and talk about financing, because at the end of the day, we got to convince a Community Works, a City of Greenville, or a City of Spartanburg to write a check. So how do we do that? Are there guarantees that we can get to the table? United States Department of Agriculture, Housing and Urban Development, for multifamily is HUD D4, 223F. I think, did I just see a 202 come out? Have you? Okay, maybe it was just an advertisement for a class, but anyway, so all the different programs, another alphabet soup of different programs depending on, I will say this, for whatever reason, the churches tend to gravitate to those 202s a lot, but you don't really get to pull the equity out, but I don't want to get into that conversation too much, but federal guarantees, other guarantees, as we can do it. Can we use the grants as a way of reducing our expenses? What we have been able to do successfully, and it's interesting, I mean, it is a little bit of risk, but it tends to be easier for the faith-based community, is to use the federal dollars for some of our pre-development, because at least internally, it doesn't feel like we're writing our own checks to pay for the most risky money in the project, but it does mean we got to figure out something that'll work so we don't have to pay it back. So we have to figure out some type of project that works. Partnering, of course, if we can bring in somebody who has the expertise, has a track record, are there other ways of how we increase revenue, whether that's including some commercial space, something along those lines. But how do we, I use the word enhancement because that's the word that our lenders use, how do we make it look more traditional of what they're used to seeing that meets their metrics? If Community Works wants to see a 90% loan to value and a 1.15 debt coverage ratio, how do we get there and start playing with those numbers to figure out how to do it? Either I'm pushing my rents up, and maybe that means, okay, we can't serve, goes back to previous conversation, maybe we can't serve all affordable. Maybe we need half as market rate to get some more revenue to make that an expensive piece of it. So those are the key items there. Questions?
So actually you could do a mixed community.
Yes. Mixed income community, yes, very much so. And Ms. Franklin, don't hit me for this next slide. But all right, so common financing issues. We start breaking and segmenting it into different components. Construction financing, bridge. Maybe we've got a gap that we've got to figure out. We've purchased it. We're paying short-term money on an acquisition. I'm in that position right now. Purchased some apartments that were previously a low-income housing tax credit project, but took out a short-term loan to go back through the process of resyndicating for tax credits, so needing a short 18-month or 24-month loan in the meantime. In the meantime, the state changed all the rules in the meantime, but that's a whole nother conversation. But that's an example from a bridge financing standpoint. Loan participation, Community Works has talked about that a couple times, either today and last week. They cap out at $1 million, is that right? Yes, so we have $1 million cap. So if we're talking about a $5 million loan, then they will be willing to participate with another lender to lend the other $4 million. So loan participation. Proceeds, pre-development, land acquisition, construction. It's getting harder and harder to get the pure land acquisition by itself. But maybe as a land acquisition pre-development, as long as we can show what that back end takeout. Are there other financing options? Subsidies are what we can look at. So there may be some other programs or opportunities we can look at. Questions, thoughts? Again, this is just trying to segment in terms of what the uses would be for and how the different financing issues, and these are all going to be structured differently depending on what it is that we need.
you mean by back end takeout? Talk about redevelopment.
Ah, okay. So, thank you. Sometimes I fail to speak English, so I like somebody to help me translate. All right. In real terms, if we're looking at a piece of property and we want to do 25 units of apartments, we could easily spend $200,000 in engineering, architecture, market feasibility study, environmental, all of that stuff we talked about, so we have on that list in there, pre-development. We got options. We can reach in our pocket, and as long as we're not coming out with dust and lint, we can write those checks. We might need to borrow those dollars. So if we go to Community Works and say we need a $200,000 loan to do all of this assessment, how are we going to pay off that pre-construction or pre-development loan for all that conceptual? Someone has got to give us a construction loan. Someone has got to give us a permanent loan. And when permanent, I'm talking about something more than 24 months, something that is a long-term note that if it's multifamily, that's just, principal and interest that's going forward, or at least 2 years, 3 years, if we're doing for sale, to sell out all the units in the project. If we're doing 36 units, how long we're going to take us to sell all that out. So when I say back end, what is the permanent money that's going to be in place as a part of this financing, okay? Someone has to pay off that loan. And in this particular case, most of the time, the lenders on the front end are going to know where that money's coming from. Is it going to be the sale of the property? Is it going to be refinancing? Is it going to be actually moving forward into the development? Something along those lines. Now, in some cases, it may be you say, let's increase our loan if the deal blows up and pay it off that way. But there has to be a primary and secondary way of how that pre-development loan is going to get paid off. Y'all want to add anything to that comment? He's in his computer. All right. Okay. All right. Questions, thoughts, or issues? Anything? Okay. All right. So, making the ask. There comes a point where we've got to make the ask. You have with you, and I'm not going to try and go through the entire piece, but what I call a loan submission package checklist. If we've hired our civil engineers to lay out a conceptual site plan of what it looks like. If we're talking about multifamily, we're looking at what our floor plans are. We've put together what that development budget. That development budget just says what are all those soft costs, all those professional fees, architectural engineers, all of that. Some money for interest carry, some oops money of contingency of what happens, our construction numbers, and anybody want to guess what's my favorite line in the development budget? What's your favorite line in development budget? What'd you say?
I'm just trying to understand what you mean.
Oh, so the development budget, I'm saying all of the costs that we've talked about so far, and we talked in terms of services. Somebody to draw it up, some soil testing, some surveying, all of those, and I was just kind of being a little bit silly, but we also have to get paid as a part of the process. So we as the developers, the church, the body, have a development fee as a part of, just like we're paying the architect for their time, we have a development fee that pays for our time. So I was being a little bit funny. I said, what's my favorite line in the development budget? Is a development fee. Okay? And we have to make sure that we as the church body includes that we are including a development fee as a part of that. That is an eligible business item, item. So we'll put our operating pro forma that just talks about income, expenses, how's this thing going to function long term? And then who's doing this? Pastor's resume, folks, the lenders want to know the church leadership. They want to know the church history. All of those key pieces. Contractors' qualifications, your development partners' qualifications. Are they qualified? Have they done this before? All of those. And then the financial statements that we've already talked about. So but those are the things as we get ready to make a loan request that we include as a part of that. I include a bonding company just for giggles, and sometimes another way of insurance just to make sure that everybody's going to do what they're supposed to and the contractor's going to get out. It might add 12, 15% to the cost of the actual construction or whatever that number might be. But for the insurance to know that in the event that something happens, that somebody can step in financially and finish the project. But that's really the nuts and bolts of what is it that we're going to have to submit to make the request for these dollars. If it's a private deal, maybe some guarantors, somebody who would actually personally guarantee, but here we're saying this is a function of the church or the church's nonprofit or our nonprofit partner, so maybe we're not doing that. Any other market information? Rent roll is basically a list of who's there, who's paying rent for something that's existing from a typical standpoint that we need to submit. Now, I want to make time for some concluding comments. Certainly we can talk a little bit about construction loans, risk, market risk, that sort of thing. But before we do that, because we're getting short on time, anything on your hearts and minds that we have not discussed that you want to have some more information on?
I just want to know how I can contact everybody, contact you specifically.
All right.
And seeing that you're in the Charleston area, sounds like more so, who's the contact person for up here in Greenfield?
Well, all right. So actually, okay. So let me make a quick transition to and I want to talk about sort of next steps contact. Certainly, most of you should have one of my pastor's cards. I think I started running them, so I actually put some of my development cards out as well. But there's some more up here that has Pastors Inc. It's pastorsinc.org. You can actually, oh, you know what? So this is another thing. So all right, I'm going to make a quick comment. One of the things that the pandemic finally forced communities of brown and black in particular to go ahead and embrace technology that we have not wanted to embrace so far. Right. Okay? And the pandemic sort of forced some of that as well. So I just decided to put a QR code. You can take your camera and clear, and you can take you directly to the contact page, and you can send me a message. But you got my card there, so you don't have to do that. But the Pastors Inc. piece from there. But I do want to talk about follow-up and with Community Works. Community Works, as a partner to make sure that we provide good information to identify what type of assistance and guidance you're looking for, your goals for your project, and to foster more engagement in terms of development. Certainly, if we are able to package something up and present to them, then they can decide from an underwriting standpoint if it's something that they want to take on. Or, and Community Works is really good about this, and there are other lenders who are good about this, is if it's not something that they do or something that's beyond that they can't partner with, is saying, here's another methodology here how you can approach it. And I'm the same way. If it's something that's outside of my box, I'm like, here's somebody who can help you do that. I'm certainly available as a resource, but I'm not treating it as a commercial. We are truly looking to partner on projects, and certainly here, welcome. I want to, as a result of this, make sure we communicate back with Community Works that those who express a desire to move forward on something, that we have a three-way conversation with Community Works as to here is a desired interest to do X, Y, or Z, whatever that might be, and come to this next phase. Okay, so we're here, capacity build development intensive. It may be depending on the size of the organization, like in Orangeburg, we have St. Stephen's United Methodist listing that they, as their actual visioning committee, are meeting as a committee to listen and discuss this. And hopefully when we finish, you all can have your own internal conversation of what this means for your acres that you all have. But at some point, it will have to transition into some type of project management, if you will, to actually look at moving forward. Some of you may already have a team in place. If not, we can certainly help and part of that conversation. But we do want to coordinate back as it relates to those conversations and what those goals and objectives are, because we want you to be successful. Community Works, obviously, they're in the business as a community development financial institution to provide the underlying loans and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we want you to come out with something successful. And part of my role, not necessarily for Community Works, from a pastor's standpoint, is, in plain English, does that dog hunt? That dog don't hunt. Michael Jackson and them had that song, "We Are the World, We Are the Children." What? Come on, y'all remember that, okay? And that is a good point of beginning, but can we translate that "We Are the World" vision into something that is actionable? And sometimes we can do that, and sometimes we can't. And I am always going to tell you what I think you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And sometimes that don't taste so good. It's like my Geritol. I know it's good for me, but those first couple, and they've added sugar lately the last few years, so it's not as bad as it used to be. But I still like my iron supplement, but it don't taste good going down. But I think we have to, because that's the only way we can pivot and position ourselves to turn something that's actionable. Because here's the reality. Most of the time, it just takes a twist and an adjustment to take something that becomes actionable, that we can move on. But if we're stuck on, no, I want to do it this way, then we got to have that conversation. And I want to make sure we have that conversation and quite honestly, I like having lenders at the table, because a lot of times when it's like, well, I say something and y'all look at me and say, huh? And I can say, ask him, ask her. And the guy who's writing the check can tell you, this is what needs to happen to make that dog hunt. And it's not coming from me, it's coming from a loan officer. And then you can have the same conversation with 2 or 3 loan officers and kind of help frame that issue. But at the end of the day, typically we can get to something that's actionable, but it means adjustment. So for example, and I'm gonna go back and use my project that I had up earlier about the subdivision that I did. My original vision for it was, as I said, young professionals. And the contractor that I worked with did high-end homes. And his comment to me that was foundational. He said, take the bedrooms off the first floor and put elevators in it. Now, I'm not promoting for you all to do this, but what I'm saying is the shift of the market, that now we're targeting empty nesters, retirement folks. The product didn't change, just who I'm going after changed. And so sometimes a pivot in what we're doing can make the difference of how we're going about it. Miss Julia made a great suggestion. If we're having trouble making our numbers work, sometimes going smaller is better. Take it down and do some SROs. We get more density, they're paying less, but maybe that's one solution that might work. Or maybe it might avail us to some money that we otherwise might not qualify for. So we might have to look and twist at it. And I don't purport to have all the issues, all the answers, but a phone call, and we can have a conversation with somebody who might give us some insight as to how do we make something financeable or bankable, and what is the issue and where we stand. And there are some, like right now, I mean, I'm struggling with the church right now. The project's a $120,000 gap. I don't know. It may mean, you know what, one solution is, I know we want to achieve the affordable housing goal. Maybe we write the check back to the city and just do market rate and make as much money as we can. That might be part of the recommendation. So we've got to do that. But my accountability to you is to tell you what I think you need to know. My accountability to Community Works is to make sure that if we're following up on something, that they're aware, know what the conversation. I mean, and I'm here, and I'm as part of Pastor's Pipeline. We want to keep projects in the, and I'm sorry, and to, I think your Anya's question, you know, we've transitioned to work statewide now. Okay, so we've done projects in Greenville. We're looking at some things in Greenville. We're looking at something in Spartanburg. So we have the bandwidth and the platform. Miss Denise has been very helpful and instrumental in getting arms around the market and what's happening on the ground locally, and some other partners, and certainly, you know, Community Works in terms of understanding. So, you know, we're here and we are a resource, and yes, call me, email me. If you don't get a response back quick, send me a text, and, you know, kind of work from there. But I think that the key thing is we got to massage the vision, we've got to do it. But I come back to one thing. If it is a faith-based project, you have to do your homework internally with your folks. Okay? That I can't do. People can look and say, I mean, I'm fortunate I have a nice track record of success, but most of the time, not most of the time, it's the leadership that provides the bandwidth internally to get the decisions done, to make the hard decisions. And that's where it becomes. So it really does rest both from clergy and the lay leaders to do it. Because here's the odd piece about it. Think about this. We need to think about when I talk about stakeholders and partners, let me talk about one person in each of y'all's church. It's the quiet one that's sitting in the back that don't say nothing when you're in the meeting, but then works the phone tree and calls Sister Mary, Sister Jones, and has Pastor lost his ever-loving mind? Thank you. That's okay. Okay. They're not going to object in the meeting. They're going to wait until the meeting is over and start the phone calls. Okay? That's real. And we have to anticipate that and engage those who might create turbulence because, and I'm going to end and share with this one piece. I had a situation, church had an ancillary house building and lot adjacent, and we were retained to come in, put a development plan. We came up with a 5-story building for senior housing, beautiful plan. And I think the first time, this was an AME church, the first time we met with the stewards. When we came back to present the plan, it was the stewards and the trustees. And all heck broke loose. Because I thought we were going to use this for this purpose. I was like, when y'all figure out what you want to do, call me. That's not my fight. This group over here asked us to do this. This group over here had another vision, but y'all in the same church. Y'all got to figure that out. And by the way, I never got a phone call back. And it wasn't anything about the technical piece of the project. It's internally, there was not consolidated will of what to do. And those are the technical pieces, the political pieces that Reverend Miller was talking about internally is we got to handle our house in order as a part of that. The real estate is hard enough, y'all. Crunching the numbers and that. Now, and I'm not saying to scare you. I mean, it's fun stuff. It's good stuff. And it is a great feeling when we get it done. But we have to have an honest conversation amongst ourselves up front about not just the technical stuff, but about the internal political stuff that we have to work through to be successful. And that's just the way that I approach the world and view it in terms of how we look at it. So I appreciate the time today. Katie, if you want to come up here, please, ma'am. For the folks in Beaufort, Love House, for the folks in Orangeburg at St. Stephen's United Methodist Church, and Bishop Redford, for you and ecumenical folks in Columbia. We appreciate you all as a part of the live stream. Just one quick fact check. No other text coming in, no other piece in the chat, anything else? We're good there. All right, questions, thoughts here? If not, I certainly appreciate the time. We are here as a resource. We want you engaged. We want to see successful, we want to see them profitable. We want to see them serve the community. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to pay Community Works back or whoever the loan the group is at the end of the day and have it to make it happen. So we appreciate your time, your energy. You could be anywhere on a Saturday morning, so I thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all for coming. You heard from Paul, he's our director of lending. And then the green packets in front of you has a whole set of information about community.